Okay, I'm live once again. I was live for a little while yesterday. It's very hot here. Um, Air conditioning doesn't work in my little studio area. So if you do hear the low hum of a fan, that's just the way it is. Deal with it. You can still hear my voice clearly. Um, this live stream or series of live streams um, will be me reading. Hey, John aside. This live stream, this series of live streams will be me reading in its entirety my book, NYMZA, How America Sold Its Soul. So if you're seeing this after it was running live, this is the explanation for what it is you're hearing if you jumped in midstream. And hello, Bodie Conley. Now, once I get started reading, I'm not going to be addressing comments in the live stream. When I take a break from the actual reading of the book, then I'll glance over there. So just be aware, folks, I'm not ignoring anyone to be rude, but I'm going to be reading the book. So there you go. And if you're unfamiliar with my book, NYMZA, How America Sold Its Soul, I published this in 2023, going on 3 years ago now. And in the book, I warn about the grip of a particular brand of fascism in the United States since World War II. And I'll go into that in the book. And basically, it explains from my perspective, this is my hypothesis, and I'm not the only one who sees and has talked about elements of this, as you'll learn. But what's interesting is the particular brand of fascism gripping the U.S. today is theo-fascism, a form of that. But anyway, this was my book that was an attempt to give people a heads up. And in true fashion in the United States, with political tribalism and teamism and the social games that get played with that, it's a book that's gone mostly ignored. People would rather hear about UFOs and breakaway civilizations. And interestingly enough, the word NYMZA comes from my breakaway civilization research. More specifically, it comes from Charles Delshow. And anyway, I think I explain most everything in the book. So welcome everybody in the live chat. I'm going to open up the file so I can read the book. Let me make sure that I'm not screwing up the live stream here. Oh, okay, I can see myself. Now, you guys, I want to make sure that I can see myself still live, so there's not a problem. So where I've got to open the window to read the book is over the live stream box. So I cannot see the comments right now. Again, I'm not trying to be rude, but the point of this live stream is for me to read this book to you. So without further ado, let me hold on a second here. I have to, there it is, make the typeface just a little bigger so I can see it. Now, I want to tell you, this was the most difficult book I've ever had to work on. It's not a happy book. It's not really a fun book. It's just information that I think people should know. And again, the people in the live stream can bring the newbies who hop in up to speed. This is a book that I published in 2023, 3 years ago now. And by the time I'm done reading it, you'll see that it was, well, I kind of saw what was coming. So here we go. This is Walter Bosley reading NYMZA, How America Sold Its Soul, in its entirety. So it might be, if I get through this in one long, hours-long stream, great. If not, I'll pause. There will be a section, and then I'll pick up in the next section when I'm able to jump in again. But I'm not going to take forever, to get through this. I want to get through this today or this weekend. So anyway, one of the things before I get started that just really alarmed me was I decided to do this last night. And this morning I saw where conservative influencer Steven Crowder, go check it out. He did a YouTube thing 4 days ago in which he defends fascism and suggests that maybe fascism isn't that bad. Folks, that's where we're at. The people in that particular camp are arguing that fascism may not be so bad. I want you to think about that. Think about that shit. Anyway. So, here we go. Prologue. No one wants to see their home fall to an enemy, but fall it will, and we have been complicit in it. Our leaders became increasingly corrupt until they wittingly participated in the subjugation of the people. We, the people, grew to enjoy leisure more than we valued the virtues of effort, and thus placed more trust than we ever should have in our elected officials. The result was a population fooling itself into believing that the nation was safe. We set ourselves up after our first major victory on the world stage, and we were readily taken advantage of by cunning foes whose existence to most of the population remains a fantasy of a paranoid fringe. Our road to destruction began at the end of World War II and is coming to its tragic destination 80 years later. We have a hard, bitter road ahead of us if we wish to see the nation survive the coming defeat. Generally, I try to steer clear of the politics of the day. Where the subject of this book is concerned, politics could not be avoided, for it was and is part of the root cause of the issue. I go into politics here only to the extent necessary to illustrate my points. So what happened? How did we go from vanquishing hero of world conflict to become an imperialist bully, lapdog of a hidden hand? The answer is money and technology. It was determined that the so-called New World, actually very old, was necessary to capture the resources required to dominate the rest of the globe. Thus, a new vision was formed, that of a nation unfettered by the traditional bonds of governance and domination, a nation free to exploit the resources necessary to thrive, far from the complications of its colonial masters, yet all the while monitored and influenced by its future overlords. Oops, wrong arrow. In due time, they were confident the new nation would provide them the wealth and power to realize their vision of global control. These prospective overlords would use such a sleeping giant to usurp the future and craft an entire century to their liking, all the while convincing their unwitting victim that the nation was unique in the world, impervious to the very powers weaving its web around them. But it doesn't stop at global domination. This world and all its resources are just a step along the way for the true objective to dominate off this planet in space. The level of perfidy in the last years of the 19th century and all through the 20th soared to the same heights which technological masters carried modern mankind into the stars. The parasite made its move, and the host was penetrated in the name of defending all that is good and true. It was a relatively quick invasion, wrapped in a cloak of righteous necessity. Weary of conflict, the host showed no resistance. It would soon become apparent that something was wrong, but by that time, it would be too late. To be clear, Germans in general were not nor are the problem. Some Germans in particular were and are the issue. A particular group that took root and emerged within what would become Germany but which has roots reaching farther back in history than any Europeans. I refer to them as NYMZA, to borrow from Charles Delschow. NYMZA hasn't been only Germans for a long time, but the modern NYMZA issue did start in Germany, thus we must go there. It is my speculative opinion that this curious group was behind the rise and post-war duplicity of the Nazis through which the United States was manipulated. This book presents what Operation Paperclip actually was and what it has brought us to. We, as this present nation, are doomed. Our fall was designed and determined before the end of World War II. Like a Trojan horse, a secret cabal slipped inside our defenses and led an invasion, a quiet invasion. We, like the Trojans, accepted the gift of the horse with open arms because we were scared and believed the gift was offered to protect us. It was not. Chapter 1. The Oxford Dictionary defines the word influence as, quote, the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself, end quote. In the world of intelligence operations and the tradecraft of espionage, influence is refined to a subtle art. Much can be accomplished through a mere suggestion well placed and carefully timed. Subtlety is key. A single drop in a calm pool of water can generate rippling waves. Nikola Tesla once nearly brought down a skyscraper with the mere tapping of a tiny hammer on a single girder. An entire nation might be brought to its knees, starting with a single drop of influence. Because a small touch of influence can be so powerful, it might also be traced and identified, and that poses a problem should the party involved not wish to reveal its hand. A true influence agent practices patience. His job is often autonomous. Usually placed within a targeted social context, the influence agent's mission is to carefully weave his way through a milieu to achieve optimum effect, all the while wielding a subtle hand in the suggestions, musings, and nudges that are among his available tools. The objective: manipulate select individuals to take preferred actions. It's that simple. It may be impossible to identify an influence agent. The easier task is sometimes to identify the target of the influence. The reason should be obvious. The targeted individual is the one who takes the more overt action, such as a vote or a statement, and certainly an activist position would be a clue. During my time in counter-espionage investigations, I learned and became experienced at hunting foreign spies and citizens turned to treason by them, their recruitment based upon personal motives, of course. Other types of criminals share with spies the desire to not get caught, thus tradecraft, methods often adopted by those other types of criminals who usually don't wield them as adeptly. It's up to the investigator to commit to the often tedious process of positively identifying the spy, and that process involves observation and a lot of thread pulling, which starts with what we call reason to believe. As a special agent of the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, you employ a set of criteria constituting a so-called reason to believe, also known as probable cause. These criteria are a bit different in some respects because the general behavior of a common criminal is usually less attentive to incriminating tells than is your bona fide spy. The perp committing espionage knows what they're doing and must be on their guard. But there are some who don't realize a line has been crossed, and this is the category in which I place the target of influence. This person is targeted because of their job, much like a spy is. The difference being that the influence target is usually just doing their job. The spy eventually steals classified, for example, wittingly commits the crime. The influence target is convinced that their manipulated action is their own idea and is good. So, in order to even begin to know where to look for these targets of influence, we must look for reason to believe. Since we are concerned with a military industrial complex expanded wildly since the end of World War II, specifically itself the product of tremendous influence wielded by the enemy of that conflict, we must begin there. The interests of the military industrial complex would be served by said influence suggested here. In the United States, the U.S. Congress holds the purse strings upon which the Department of Defense and its associate departments must rely in order to function. Therefore, I look to Congress for individuals susceptible to nefarious influence. That means pertinent congressmen and congresswomen. I suggest that the first places to look are the U.S. House and Senate Armed Services Committees and the equivalent committees on intelligence. These are the bodies through which the people are supposed to be guaranteed that the DoD, etc., are being provided what they need for national defense and playing by the rules. Because the United States has veered off into empire building since the day after World War II ended, national defense has been a phrase much abused through the years by many of the very people entrusted with oversight. Let's start with the House committees. The House Armed Services Committee was created by consolidating two existing committees, the Committee on Military Affairs and the Committee on Naval Affairs, under the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. Look at that, the year after World War II ended. Isn't that interesting within the context of a covert invasion via Operation Paperclip the year before? Let's continue with a look at the current members as of this writing. Now remember, folks, this was 2023 when I wrote this. I'll continue. Mike Rogers, Republican, is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. I don't know if he still is right now, off the top of my head. Rogers' political background is interesting. Early in his political journey, Rogers was promised a seat on the committee should he win his election. That promise was made by Dennis Hastert, also Republican, and then, Speaker of the House between 1999 and 2007, and subsequently convicted of sexual abuse of teenage boys. That's Dennis Hastert. Not one to stay down, Hastert went on to become an advisor to lobbyist law firm Dickstein Shapiro. Founding member David Shapiro served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, leaving active duty in 1946. Shapiro represented clients. Okay, hold on. Shapiro represented clients targeted during the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC era. That's McCarthy and all that. I have a footnote there. Oh, in my footnote, I recommend that you read Blacklisted by History, The Untold Story of Senator Joe McCarthy by M. Stanton Evans. I'll continue. Remember, this was written in 2023, 3 years ago, published. Shapiro, himself a Jew, interestingly and reluctantly once represented American Nazi Party leader George Lincoln Rockwell in a freedom of speech case. In 2001, Dickstein Shapiro merged with Roberts, Sheridan, and Cotel, itself spun off from Cravath, Swain, and Moore. Paul Drennan Cravath was an Atlantist, a political movement dating back prior to the First World War. Atlantists believed the governments of North America and Europe should unite to promote globalist multiculturalism. Cravath is credited with being the movement's primary proponent in the United States after the war. To that aim, To that aim, Cravath was a founder and director of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. I doubt that such a commitment to globalism was forsaken in the subsequent merger with Dixine Shapiro. But wait, there's more. Cravath, Swaine, and Moore has a history with the industrialization of America. The firm represented well-known inventors, Samuel F.B. Morse in the late 1840s, Cyrus McCormick, Elias Howe, and Charles Goodyear in the 1850s, and George Westinghouse in the 1880s. Note the concurrence of the rise of Prussia and the legend of the Sonora Aero Club, NYMZA, and the 1890s airship mystery during this same age. The firm has a long history with clients in the U.S. railroad industry, beginning with the New York and Erie and Union Pacific Railroads, as well as express delivery businesses, Adams, Southern, and Wells Fargo. Let me go to the footnote. Yes, when I mentioned the Union Pacific, we must note that this client brings E.H. Harriman into the resume of Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, and with him his son Avril, best friend of Prescott Bush, which itself points to Nazis. In these clients, we find a historical link to the industrial part of the military-industrial complex. Cravath, Swaine, and Moore really bring it to Dixine Shapiro, as some of their current client relationships were carried over. Clients whom CS&M also started representing in the 19th century, J.P. Morgan, PricewaterhouseCoopers, among others in the financial world. CS&M also represented CBS, if you want to tag media in here. All these aforementioned clients and Cravath's globalist commitment qualify this law firm for serious consideration when identifying the NYMZA/Nazi international milieu, and thus, by extension, Dixine Shapiro. Are we to assume that no transnational agenda, nor even sentiments of it, remained by the time of Speaker Hastert's tenure with them? We cannot make that assumption. It would be irresponsible because it would be too easy for such an influence agent to be embedded within the firm. In Hastert's obviously compromised position, working with the firm following a sexual predator scandal, he's not likely to go against anyone or anything at Dixine Shapiro. Ooh, sorry, I'm stumbling over that name. In fact, I think I was saying Dixine Shapiro, but it's Dixine Shapiro. I apologize for that. But hey, I'm reading live. Don't bitch, you're getting this book for free. If Hastert had political influence with Rogers, Mike Rogers now, remember, who in 2023 was in Congress. If Hastert had political influence with Rogers before the scandal, before Hastert's sex abuse scandal, we cannot assume that influence necessarily ended afterwards. Here is where we find potential access between Rogers and the Nazi International /NYMZA, any presence of transnationalists in Dixine Shapiro. Another big clue among the Dixine Shapiro clients is Bayer, the American subsidiary of Bayer AG, the famous German pharmaceutical company. In true Prussian Junkers Bull of Rimini fashion, Bayer extended the German claws into America in the mid-19th century through the marketing of aspirin. This required operations in the United States, of course, putting the company in place even prior to German unification. Bayer in America is the very example of what we're discussing in this book, making it very easy for influence agents to have been placed through the subsidiary office. If we must consider that, we must also then consider that said influence agents could have access to influence with employees and partners of the law firm representing their interests. It would not matter what year or century Dixine Shapiro's representation of Bayer began. Agents in place mean opportunity of access. For the record, Baer had dropped Dixon Shapiro shortly before Hastert was indicted for lying to federal investigators about spending $3.5 million to silence victims in the sexual abuse case. The banks from which Hastert withdrew the money include two globalist suspect institutions. Old Second counts BlackRock among its primary shareholders, but Castle Bank takes the NYMZA cake here. An offshore institution located in the Bahamas, Castle was established as a source of funds for the Central Intelligence Agency by OSS veteran CIA officer Paul Helliwell, former supervisor of JFK assassination milieu suspect E. Howard Hunt during the agency's anti-Castro operation days, thus raising a huge red flag within our context here. Did Castle Bank play any role in the JFK assassination milieu? Because I think the NYMZA Nazi International faction of the CIA sure did. If so, we can reasonably consider the presence of their influence agents affiliated in some manner with Castle Bank. What does this mean for Dennis Hastert? It means that we must now consider the hand of a NYMZA Nazi influence agent in the apparent extortion and exposure of former Speaker Dennis Hastert's sexual abuse scandal. An influence agent within Castle Bank could easily have tipped off authorities. Why? Perhaps Hastert had crossed them in some way. The same influence agent could have created the problem and offered Hastert a way out, which the former congressman refused to take. The accuser was reportedly working with authorities, so it's also important to consider that the agency, as in the CIA, was pulling the strings on behalf of the influence agent. Whatever the case, that it's possible demands to be considered. Welcome to the murky world of influence espionage. What does all this mean for Mike Rogers, the 2023 ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee? That Dennis Hastert was a sponsor or mentor to Speaker Rogers means that the influence agents would have been vetting him. If there were indeed influence agents working Hastert, they would have been lazy and foolish to not also be working for access to the guy Hastert promised a seat on a committee of logical interest to NYMZA Nazi International objectives. But Hastert isn't the only potential problem for Rogers where this examination is concerned. There is also Tom DeLay. Rogers received campaign contributions from former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay's ARMPAC, A-R-M-P-A-C. DeLay was himself convicted of felony money laundering of campaign finances as well as conspiracy to launder money. 3 years later, DeLay was acquitted, but there are other ethical issues that kept coming up, various suspicions of financial malfeasance, questionable integrity. DeLay's history would prevent anyone else from being given a security clearance, but he was elected. With Hastert, you wonder what kind of company Rogers keeps elsewhere. Pertinent to the hypothesis of this book, Rogers has been a major proponent of the Space Development Agency. He is an aggressive advocate for space militarization, an enterprise near and dear to NYMZA's heart. In 2017, Rogers proposed to establish Space Corps under the Department of the Air Force. 2 years later, the independent United States Space Force was established. Arguably, the biggest step that any modern empire can take toward global dominance is military presence off the planet. Getting to outer space was the objective upon which Operation Paperclip was activated in the first place, and has been the first and ultimate goal of the military-industrial complex of the United States since 1945. You might say that a dominant presence in space is what the Prussian Junker's vision for infestation of the United States was really all about. Why do I suggest that? The subject of what's in space has been a bone of contention between the government and the people who have witnessed UFOs for decades. The space race of the Cold War saw an explosion of development toward high altitude flight capabilities and satellite technology. The public face of the space race, brought to you by NASA, is another clue. That there is evidence, contentious though some say it is, that JFK was going to share U.S. space intel and technology with the Soviets, suspiciously close to when he was assassinated. The U.S. Air Force began to overtake the Navy as the tip of the American military spear during Vietnam. Essentially, the greatest investment in technology for the military has been in aerospace. Our U.S. military industrial complex has been pushing toward the stars pretty heavily since the end of World War II, and the first real step was bringing Luftwaffe aviation medicine scientists, German rocket engineers, and aerospace experts into our trust with Operation Paperclip. Now, perhaps you understand why I suggest that the U.S. venturing boldly into space with a very public military branch was the objective of the invasion all along. If I'm right, the desire to influence the U.S. House Armed Services Committee would be strong. With the issues of character coming into question with two of Mike Rogers' supporters, Hastert and DeLay, and God knows who else, we have to wonder if Rogers is susceptible to compromise, or was in 2023. If NYMZA slash Nazi International Military Industrial Complex masters can control congressional armed services committees, and the U.S. Senate has one also, then they can continue to get their way. It's worth it to them. I recommend the reader take a closer look at other select members of Rogers' committee, or take a closer look at the committee as it is presently, and decide for yourself if you should be concerned about who's providing so-called oversight to our military-industrial complex. Start with certain criteria and go from there. Not to cast aspersions on military veterans, for I am one myself, you should consider military service as a criteria for logical reasons, primarily because an influence agent will use a veteran whether that person is a sellout or not. Targets with integrity can still be manipulated to vote certain ways. My first choices for scrutiny are the following. Now, remember, folks, listening to me read this book, this was 2023. Okay, so I was referring to the people who were in office in 2023. Some still are, some are not. But as of 2023, I recommended looking at the following congressmen. Joe Wilson, a graduate of Morton Blackwell's Leadership Institute. Blackwell is a conservative activist whose pedigree includes being state chairman of his Young Republicans chapter in Louisiana. That organization was founded in 1931 by George Olmsted, a U.S. Army officer who would serve under General Albert Wiedemeyer in the China-Burma-India theater. And I have a footnote you're going to find interesting on that General Albert Wiedemeyer and Olmsted topic. I refer you to Joseph Farrell on the Wiedemeyer Associations to other interesting threads of money and power. Okay, I'll continue. Mike Turner, also ranking member on the Committee on Intelligence. Turner's ex-wife, Majida Murad, was with the U.S. Department of Energy and globalist affiliated via the Atlantic Council, an organization promoting the aforementioned Atlanticism linked to Mike Rogers. Turner was an advocate for the F-35 aircraft, thus an ally, witting or unwitting, to the military-industrial complex. Doug Lamborn. He began his political career in Colorado Springs, what you might call a military-industrial complex capital, with Peterson Space Force Base, Shriver Space Force Base, Cheyenne Mountain Space Force Station, U.S. Space Command, Space Operations Command, Fort Carson, the U.S. Air Force Academy, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, L3 Harris Technologies, SAIC, SAIC, which spell that backwards and you'll get a clue to who they're affiliated with. SAIC. ITT, Lockheed Martin, and BlueStack are all located there, being Colorado Springs. Lamborn represents these interests in Congress and is, in my opinion, an obvious target for influence agents of the imperialistic-minded military-industrial complex masters. Being on the Committee on Military Affairs and Appropriation further emphasizes my point regarding Lamborn. Let me get rid of this pop-up. Additionally, Lamborn is a member of the Directed Energy Caucus, which should raise some eyebrows among readers of this book. Next is Rob Whitman. Adopted by American parents, Whitman is interestingly of German descent. And I have a little note there I want to remember. Millions of Americans are of German ancestry, so we must resist temptation to make hay of this. I just thought it interesting considering our context here. Still, I wonder if we know who his parents were. Continuing about Rob Whitman. He is a member of the Delta Tau Delta fraternity, which is affiliated historically with the Rainbow fraternity, aka the Mystic Sons of Iris, whose past members include Henry Wallace, America's infamously esoteric vice president under FDR. Other Delta Tau Delta or DTD brothers include actors Matthew McConaughey and Robert Armstrong, who was in King Kong in 1933, and also Archibald Butt, military advisor to Teddy Roosevelt. Butt died on the RMS Titanic. I primarily include Whitman on this list because an influence agent will use anything, including mere ancestral identity. For those just popping in or wondering what the hell I'm reading in its entirety my 2023 book, NYMZA, How America Sold Its Soul. And remember, I'm going through people presently who could be or could have been targets of influence agents. Remember, the target of an influence agent can be unwitting. It doesn't necessarily mean that the target is a bad person. It just means they can be used, unaware that they are being used for nefarious purpose. Believe me, I'll get into who I think are bad guys soon enough in this book. I will continue. Trent Kelly, retired U.S. Army Major General. It's good for a military-industrial complex influence agent to have a high-ranking military veteran under the influence. It's easier to convince them to vote accordingly. Oh, by the way, I had another footnote here about Wallace, who I mentioned before. Wallace was friends with Nicholas Roerich, and correspondence with the Mystic Traveler made him kind of look woo and kooky to the public, unfortunately, the way it was characterized. That was the Dear Guru letter. Okay, so let's continue. Next, on the list of, as of 2003, when this was published, people in Congress who could be targets. Mike Gallagher, U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and a RAND Corporation intern. Then there's Don Bacon, a U.S. Air Force veteran who is pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia. That makes him a military-industrial complex dream boy. Michael Waltz, U.S. Army officer and a Green Beret. Waltz opposed withdrawal from Afghanistan, a position on the military-industrial complex checklist of approval. His wife is Julie Nishawat, herself a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and a security advisor to multiple administrations. Nishawat's globalist associations come with being an international affairs fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations and serving with the governing advisory council for the World Economic Forum. Waltz and his wife would be a prize for an influence agent. And at last, we come to Mike Johnson, currently Speaker of the House, by the way. At the time I wrote this, he was not yet Speaker of the House. Here's what I wrote about Mike Johnson in 2023. Mike Johnson, probably a calendar boy for bona fide Nazis. Johnson was a senior attorney and national media spokesman for the ADF, first called the Alliance Defense Fund, now the Alliance Defending Freedom. Right out of the 1934 Nazi playbook, when Germany began to actually enforce their anti-homosexuality laws, ADF called for the criminalization of homosexuality. In 2003 AD, the 21st century. This is the same ADF that defended the rights of two Christian adoption agencies to refuse prospective Jewish, LGBT, atheist, and non-Christian parents. A NYMZA/Nazi International influence agent might consider Johnson a soft target and have much to talk about over schnitzel and some chilled Riesling. That's me being a smartass. Now we know since about Mike Johnson championing the theofascism of the Heritage Foundation. I will read on. Corey Mills, U.S. Army, 82nd Airborne Division, in a non-operational specialty. Mills went corporate early, serving as a security specialist for DynCorp, maritime anti-piracy security specialist, security and risk manager for multiple corporate businesses, serving various aspects of management and supply in support of deployed forces and contractors supporting them. Add to that his tenure on the Defense Business Board. Nothing says military-industrial complex quite like Mills's resume. In my opinion, Mills is another potentially soft target for influence agents. Then we come to Ro Khanna. I would place Khanna on the maybe list of concern for influence targeting. His grandfather was dedicated to the cause of independence for India, even being imprisoned for a time. This grandfather worked with Lala Lajpat Rai, notable Indian freedom fighter who, during the World War I era, traveled to the United States during the time of the California Hindi-German conspiracy, in which intelligence operatives of both India and Germany were engaged in weapons smuggling in support of their mutual conflicts with England. I have written about this in Empire of the Wheel, Volume 1. This connection alone, though over a century ago, could inspire initial contact by an influence agent of the NYMZA Nazi International. Andy Kim. Globalist associations might make him attractive to influence agents. Kim has been a security advisor to high-ranking U.S. military personnel and including a U.S. president. Chrissy Houlihan, U.S. Air Force officer working project on air and space defense technologies. Following active duty, Houlihan spent some of her corporate time with a program that guided women and girls into careers in science, engineering, math, and technology, essentially preparation for better recruitment into the military-industrial complex. Houlihan could be very useful to the NYMZA influence agents. Jason Crow, U.S. Army Ranger and pro-Ukraine. Much influence potential here. There. What the word actually was. Elissa Slotkin, recruited from graduate school by the CIA and subsequently with the National Security Council on the Bush push to go into Iraq, then for both the State Department and the Department of Defense under Obama. Slotkin continued this military-industrial complex career path while serving as Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. She may have been NYMZA Nazi influenced for years by now. Excuse me. Continuing. Mikey Sherrill, the U.S. Navy officer and aviator, piloting helicopters and among the first women in the flight school rated for combat. Sherrill is another example of representative with military experience that likely makes them military-industrial complex friendly. Jared Golden, U.S. Marine veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. Following graduate school, Golden went to work for a global logistics firm and then as a congressional staffer for Homeland Security and the Governmental Affairs Committee. Golden is pro-Ukraine and was part of a congressional push to provide that country with F-16s. Golden hits major check marks for military-industrial complex experience and qualifies as a potential target for political influencing. Sarah Jacobs. I think she's still on this committee too. Sarah Jacobs, from graduate school right to the, as a matter of fact, I think Flying Brian's in the live chat. I believe Sarah Jacobs represents his district, San Diego down there. Jacobs, from graduate school right to the UN, Jacobs worked for UNICEF and then as a contractor to the U.S. State Department. She could be a mixed bag here. Jacobs opposed U.S. counterterrorism efforts in Africa, but she also opposed sending cluster bombs to the Ukraine. Jacobs was also involved with pushing Biden to pull troops out of Syria. Despite her globalist resume, Jacobs appears to not be much of an ally to the imperial desires of the military-industrial complex. This might get her on the NYMZA Nazi International shit list, but time will tell. Excuse me. Okay. Pat Ryan, West Point graduate and U.S. Army intelligence officer, served in Iraq. From there, Ryan went directly into the arms of the military-industrial complex. He worked for Barico Technologies, training field operatives, under subcontract in Afghanistan for Palantir Technologies. There I am in 2023, like others, talking about Palantir. The company that brought us, under subcontract in Afghanistan for Palantir Technologies, the company that brought us Palantir Metropolis, used by financial services, banks, and hedge funders. Let's scroll down and see what my footnote there was. I wonder if there's a Promise Software influence there in Palantir Metropolis. I will continue reading. Palantir also provided special software to Information Warfare Monitor, which used it to uncover 2 Chinese cyberspace spy networks. Shadow Network, let's see. Okay, Shadow Network and GhostNet were also the things that Palantir provided. Palantir software is used by the DHS, NSA, FBI, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, Special Operations Command, West Point, and the Joint IED Defeat Organization. One controversy involving Palantir is its development of Project Maven, a classified artificial intelligence program facilitating the unmanned operation of aerial vehicles, which some argue could create autonomous machines willing and able to kill in the absence of human input to the contrary. That's one for the coming technocracy, brought to you by the U.S. military-industrial complex and its NYMZA Nazi International visionaries. Last but not least on the list of Congressman Ryan's past employers is Dataminer, an AI company already under fire for illegal surveillance of U.S. citizens engaged in legal activity. Shades of person of interest. I informed the reader that one of Palantir's clients is Merck, the science and technology firm, which, during World War II, was run by Wirtschaftsführer Karl Merck, who joined the Nazi Party in 1933. The company developed and manufactured war-essential products using forced labor. Merck survived prosecution. Regardless of whether Ryan is even aware of the clear Nazi thread touching him through degrees, he is someone to watch as regards the desires of the military-industrial complex coming across his desk. He doesn't have to be one of them to be useful to them. Presently, I'm more concerned about Palantir and Dataminer, but he did work for both. Next, we have Jeff Jackson, U.S. Army JAG officer. Along with this committee, Jackson serves on Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee, the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, and under the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, he serves on the Subcommittee for Space and Aeronautics, as well as the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee. Jackson is deep in the world of the military-industrial complex interests and should be considered a target of possible influence. Chris DeLuzio, U.S. Navy JAG officer, graduate of Annapolis, and subsequently a lawyer involved in cyber law and security matters. As a congressman on this committee, DeLuzio works toward resource consolidation among elements of the defense industrial base, i.e., the military-industrial complex itself. Being that he stands up to price gouging by contractors, DeLuzio may not be considered a friend to the NYMZA Nazi International personnel who are pushing empire and high profits for participants. DeLuzio might want to watch his proverbial back. Let me close these pop-ups. Jimmy Panetta, U.S. Navy intelligence officer assigned to the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, while serving in Afghanistan. He is the son of former U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Jimmy Panetta has voted in favor of big tech, but hasn't demonstrated anything overt that I think would attract the influence agents. His pedigree of military intelligence and his father's position could, however, entice them. Those are merely the names of those in Congress presently, again, folks, as of 2023, when this book was published, in charge of maintaining the military-industrial complex. They may have changed by the time of this publication, but in spite of that rotation, there is always the deep state, the lying internationalist media, and academia long ago compromised by foreign intelligence agents, our corrupt judicial system, the Federal Reserve, central banksters, big pharma, and big tech. All these serve to use America for their own good. They care little about her destruction. How did this happen? We let that previously mentioned gift horse inside our gates. Turns out that the Trojan horse is a model used repeatedly by the problem state in question. That is, a state not strictly within borders on a map, rather a state culture with a centuries-long modus operandi of occupying other states under the guise of friendship and mutual benefit. But that is the lie. This horse does not come bearing friendship. Let me introduce the reader to Paul Winkler. Okay, guys, I'm going to take a little pause there and get some more water. Just absorb all that. I'll be right back to continue. Alrighty. I am returning. As I said, folks, it is hot in here and the air conditioning is not functioning in this room properly. So I have to use fans. Anyway, this chair. There we go. Okay. Okay. Somebody, the sound's okay? No issues with the audio? I'm asking the live chat. Okay, thank you, D. Dorothy. Okay, folks, I will continue on to chapter 2. Crinkle my wrapper here. I can't really have that as I'm trying to talk. My cough drop. Chapter 2. The Scythian Prussian Junkers. The 1,000-Year Conspiracy by Paul Winkler. Hold on a second. You're going to find this very interesting, I think. Here. The 1,000-Year Conspiracy of Paul Winkler. Or by Paul Winkler. The most disturbing... I'm stuttering at the beginning, right? See how disturbing? The most disturbing book I have read in the 10 years leading up to the writing of this book served to change my perception of my country and its history during the years of my life thus far. I can never see it any other way than I do now, thanks to Paul Winkler. Who was he? Born in 1898 in Budapest, the Jewish-Hungarian Winkler was a writer, journalist, and publisher. He ran Opera Mundi in France, Europe's largest feature syndicate. Winkler also was a distributor of comic books and established magazines, including Le Journal de Mickey, now a weekly 60-page magazine which started as an 8-page weekly, first published in October 1934. French Disney Comics publishing became a thing and continues even now. Winkler received a posthumous Disney Legends Award in 1997 for bringing Mickey Mouse to Europe. Winkler was a very successful publisher and editor in France until the Nazis invaded. It is where the Nazis are concerned that Winkler likely presented his most important work, The 1,000-Year Conspiracy, Secret Germany Behind the Mask. Published in English by Scribner's and Sons, New York in 1943, the book was written by Winkler in 1937, 2 years before the beginning of World War II, thus predating the subsequent pertinent events of this book you are reading now, making it all the more disturbingly credible. This also makes Winkler's book problematic for those with most to gain through the popular narrative of that era and after, for his own words contradict what we are supposed to believe. Quote, "This book attempts to contribute to the work of identification of the forces behind Nazism. It results from research undertaken to substantiate this hypothesis, that Nazism is not the product of some spontaneous generation crystallized by Hitler's evil genius, and that it is not, as it has often been described, simply a reaction to the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty. Finally, that Nazism does not derive from some basic trait of the German character, end quote. That was Winkler writing in his 1937 book. Winkler studied writers of what can be called the Prussian school of the 150 years leading up to the time he wrote his book. In these writers' works, Winkler found evidence that Mein Kampf was full of ideas frequently expressed well before Hitler ever did. But where did such ideas come from? Winkler attempts to retrace a centuries-old conspiracy through an examination of the covert forces actually behind the rise of what we know as Prussia and Bismarck's and Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. Of particular interest to American readers should be Winkler's revelation of a blood tribunal in the Middle Ages known as the Firma. In his investigation, Winkler attempted to identify the fundamental conspiratorial actions and believed that he had uncovered the reasons why what he calls Prusso-Teutonic forces completely diverged from other directions of Western civilization. It was here where he was convinced that Hitler's rise to power would have been impossible without a Nazi subservience to those secretive Prusso-Teutonic forces. I think I pronounced the FEMA wrong. I think it's pronounced FEMA. It's FEHME. FEMA. Isn't that interesting? Okay, I have a footnote after that sentence about Nazi subservience to those secret Prusso-Teutonic forces. Oh, okay. And it's just, I pulled that out of Winkler's book. I'm just citing where I got that. Readers of my previous works will have a better idea as to the hand behind the mysterious NYMZA after reading Paul Winkler's book. But herein I shall present the indicators along the way to illustrate what I propose is an obvious link between NYMZA and the pertinent history within this stunning context which Winkler provides. For those who are wondering what is NYMZA, allow me to provide illumination, for that curious lore is important in this examination. We first hear of the mysterious NYMZA, that's spelled NYMZA, from Charles A. Delschow. If you're not familiar with who Charles Delschow was, I recommend Dennis Crenshaw's book, Secrets of Delschow. I recommend Theo Pyman's book, John Worrell Keeley, The Free Energy Pioneer. And I also recommend Stephen Romano's book, The Art of Delschow. Delschow was a German immigrant who entered the United States through Texas. He was a butcher who was commissioned by the curious NYMZA organization to travel to the gold country west of Yosemite in California and report on his observations of the Sonora Aero Club, a group of German and Italian immigrants allegedly building and flying contraptions which used anti-gravity technology. This was in the 1850s and obviously doesn't square with known balloon technology nor the accepted history of aviation. NYMZA, says Delschow in his journal, was an organization headquartered in Germany, specifically a Prussian city in that country before its unification. And I have another footnote here that I see if I need to share with you. Okay. In Crenshaw and Romano, some sources still cite NYMZA being a New York-based organization. Delschow said it was Germany. The New York claim is based on nothing but the letters N and Y and a mistaken connection to vague references to investors from the East in the 1896 airship mystery literature. So that's that footnote. Okay. We soon learn from Delschow that he grew to admire the Sonora Aero Club, particularly its leader, Peter Menace. By the time NYMZA sends its home office representative, described as that Prussian officer, to California, Delschow is on the side of the Aero Club in its disdain for the company agent. In this episode, we see a glimpse of what the Prussians had in store for a unified Germany and the world, for the Prussian officer has come from NYMZA to express the organization's desire that the club construct militarized versions of their flying machines. The leaders of the club refuse and send the NYMZA agent packing. Not long after, Peter Menace, we are told by Delschow, dies in a fiery explosion of his flying arrow. That's AERO. Was Menace assassinated by the Prussian overlords of NYMZA? The Sonora Aero Club is apparently just one group developing exotic technology that is sponsored in some unspecified manner by NYMZA, Delschau tells us. Rather, did Peter Menace stage his death in order to escape the martial supervision of the home country? I propose that Menace's escape option is possible. In my analyses of the data surrounding Delschau's account and the 1896 airship mystery 40 years later, there appears to have been threads linking the two stories, one of personnel and the other of suspiciously similar technologies. I got a footnote there too. Okay, I refer to my book Origin, the 19th Century Emergence of the 20th Century Breakaway Civilizations, and Secret Missions 3, Destination Carcosa. My hypothesis involves Peter Menace subsequently sharing his ideas with select individuals, one of them possibly being Solomon Andrews, who demonstrated a controlled flying machine in Washington, D.C., observed by newspaper reporters and members of Abraham Lincoln's War Department. What is important here is that What is important here is that exotic technology development was at the heart of how the United States fell victim to the conspiracy revealed later by Paul Winkler, to which we must presently return. Oh, here's a pop-up I gotta get rid of. The 1,000-year conspiracy seeks to explain what is happening in Nazi Germany by the time of the Second World War. Author Winkler shares some of the philosophy expressed by German leaders who influenced the rise of Hitler and his movement. Winkler's point is that Mein Kampf didn't arise from a vacuum. Quote, this is from Winkler. Quote, in 1913, more than 10 years before the publication of this work, that's Mein Kampf, or I'm sorry, that's Winkler's book, General von Bernhardi, who had enormous influence. Wait a minute. Excuse me. I think Winkler is referring to Mein Kampf. I apologize. In 1913, more than 10 years before the publication of this work, General von Bernhardi, who had enormous influence on the army and the younger generation of Germany, stated in his book titled Our Future, quote, for us, there are two alternatives and no third world dominion or ruin, end quote. But Bernhardi does not stop there, for Winkler tells us exactly what Germany intended even before the First World War. Quoting again from Winkler, the right of conquest is universally recognized. At first, this can be effected through peaceful means. Overpopulated countries pour out streams of immigrants into other lands and territories. These immigrants, while submitting to the laws of the new land, try to create favorable living conditions for themselves, and in bold, remember this is Winkler quoting Bernhardi, conditions for themselves to the detriment of the original inhabitants and in competition with them. This means conquest. That was how Bernhardi was looking at that issue. In 1913, before Mein Kampf was ever written. What the general is telling the world tips the hand of what the culprits had been doing for centuries, but few, if any, were listening. Bernhardi described exactly the basic maneuver by which the perpetrators would subsequently invade and conquer the United States. Let Winkler further demonstrate with the history of the so-called ideal Prussians, starting with the Junkers. First, the Prussians about which we speak today, and of to whom Winkler specifically refers, are not exactly people who were of the territory once known as Prussia. Winkler explains that the term we know, more specifically the identity of a Prussian, is a philosophical fabrication. Quoting Winkler, the most ardent Prussians were not born in Prussia, for Prussianism is first of all a state of mind and a special way of thinking shaped over centuries, and to which men of diverse origins have felt strongly attracted. End quote. Winkler adds to this, quote, Prussianism, however, admits only the supremacy of the state, to which it demands absolute submission of the individual, at the expense of his liberty, his private interests, and his personal well-being. End quote. Once more, with General von Bernhardi, who summarized the idea thusly, quoting General von Bernhardi, in the final analysis, the state is bearer of all culture. End quote. So, armed with the philosophy of the state as God, enter the Junkers and their Prusso-Teutonic tradition, emerging directly from the religious order of Teutonic Knights, along with the Femic tradition derived from the notorious blood tribunal of the Middle Ages. The Junkers also exploited ties to the church. They would eventually discard any characteristics one would properly associate with a genuinely altruistic spiritual organization. I'm going to read that again. And I want you to think of a movement in this country. See if you can guess what that's describing. The Junkers also exploited ties to the church. They would eventually discard any characteristics one would properly associate with a genuinely altruistic spiritual organization. Sound familiar? Christian nationalists? Oh yeah, I know I'm going to piss some people watching or listening to this off. But the time has come to not care. Anyway, I'll continue. Winkler tells us that these so-called Prussian Junkers wear their associations like a mask. Quoting Winkler, it is extremely important that we penetrate this camouflage. It is not only useful to reveal the connection between Prussianism and present-day Germany. It is equally useful to show clearly the roots from which Prussianism originated in history long before Frederick II of Prussia and the Great Elector. Only by understanding what these roots were can we appreciate what present day, that's 1937 Germany, really is. End quote. Winkler presents the historical context of the Junkers' rise to power. Quoting again from Winkler, the Prusso-Teutonic organizations of the 20th century and the so-called Prussian spirit in general stem directly from the Teutonic Knights of the 12th century. This religious order, founded at Acre, Syria, in 1190 AD, during the time of the Crusades, from its beginning was distinguished from the two other orders of Knights of the Holy Land, the Templars and the Knights of St. John, known later as the Knights of Malta, by its strictly national, or rather racial, character. In order to join the Teutonic Knights, one had to prove pure German ancestry, noble ancestry, of course. Whereas membership in the Templars of the Knights of St. John was open to nationals of any country. Imagine that. That's me saying imagine that. Continuing with Winkler, the German Crusaders decided to found a hospital of their own in the Holy Land, reserved exclusively for German knights who were sick or wounded. A few years later, in 1198, this organization was changed into a knight's order. King Philip of Swabia took it under his patronage in 1206. The Germano-Roman Emperor Otto IV did the same in 1213. From this time on, the organization may be considered as a purely German political instrument of the highest importance. End quote. Yeah. The use of a religious facade to crusade your political bullshit. That's a Walter aside there. I will continue reading from my book. The Teutonic Knights started out as a genuinely religious order, but once secure in their foundation, began aligning their interests with territorial expansion agenda of the emperor. Hermann von Salza, Grand Master from 1210 to 1239 AD, drove the order in this direction, establishing the reputation of its true political founder. It was Salza who recognized that the order would always be lagging behind the Templars and the Hospitallers while in the Holy Land. So he directed the Teutonic Knights to cast their ambitions to the conquest of other territories. The order's first foray in this new direction was in 1211 AD when von Salza contracted with Andrew, the king of Hungary, to send a detachment of Teutonic Knights to the south of Hungary to put down pagan tribes of Transylvania. Von Salza and the order wasted no time in betraying their word regarding the limits of their charter. Quoting Winkler again, the territory reserved for the order was clearly defined in a written agreement drawn up between the king and Grand Master. Nevertheless, Andrew soon made the complaint that the knights were widely trespassing beyond the borders outlined for them, that they were coining money without authority, and finally had so cleverly maneuvered at Rome that the Pope had consented to take the territory occupied by them directly under his protection. This allowed the knights to consider this territory no longer subject to King Andrew. End quote. Though this breach of contract ultimately reflected unsatisfactorily in Hungary, von Salza continued with the campaign of offering services to monarchs with troublesome populations. A devotee of Frederick II, there was still enough reputation in von Salza's favor to broker another protection racket scheme, this time on behalf of Poland's Duke Conrad. This time around, the Teutonic Knights would be protecting Poland from its heathen Slavic Belarusians, the Belarusians, the Proto-Prussians, and authentic claimants to the cultural Prussian label. Remember, Winkler points out that the culture that became what we know as Prussians were not actual Prussians. I'll continue. This deal was greased by a bishop of whom von Salza earned trust, likely through the latter's acquaintance with the Pope, thanks to Frederick II. With this development, von Salza became an agent of the emperor's prized edict, the Bull of Rimini, bringing us at last to the document at the heart of the issue. Oh, folks, isn't this book fun? Are you enjoying it? I know I am. I will continue. In the heat of the Prussian Crusade, the Bull of Rimini was issued by Frederick II in 1235 AD and was backdated to 1226. The decree granted license for territorial conquest to the Teutonic Knights and gave them the power to acquire lands and resources. It was just what von Salza was looking for after the public relations disaster in Poland. Backed up by two subsequent documents, the Treaty of Kruszwica and the Bull of Rieti, the Rimini Decree afforded the order, quote, eternal and absolute ownership of any territory it conquered. And it is in the language of these documents that we have the problem. Winkler interprets the Bull of Rimini to be a charter for future action. And I quote from Winkler, a permanent charter for all Prussian conquest and all German political expansion, which during centuries to come and until this day, which he was writing in 1937, was to radiate from that territory. The uncompromising spirit with which the Teutonic Order pursued its aim sprang from the so-called imperial mission, which was entrusted to the order in this Bull of Rimini. The pretext of a religious mission, that means the bullshit cloak. The pretext of a religious mission justified such purposes. This is, in fact, the very origin of the secular conflict between popes and emperors. Frederick specified that his mission of empire was directed not less to subjugation than to conversion of the people. This phrase, moreover, is a clear indication of the methods by which the order was to carry out the imperial mission entrusted to it by the bull. The bull states that in this spirit, and by virtue of the invitation of Duke Conrad of Masovia, the Teutonic Order is charged with conquering the territory described, intentionally no doubt, that's Winkler's aside in his own quote, in very vague terms. The order shall enjoy the old and due imperial rights over mountains, plains, rivers, forests, and seas, end quote. You see what they're doing there? Vague and wide. Winkler suggests that this carefully crafted and vague language provided imperial sponsorship for all future activities of the order, regardless of the nature of said actions. Furthermore, Winkler proposes that this open-ended license was always the original intention. Quoting Winkler, the bull further confirms that all territory conquered or received as a gift by the order shall belong to it entirely, with all the rights and privileges of a sovereign imperial prince, including the right to levy taxes and duties, coin money, exploit all sorts of mines, name judges, impose territorial laws, etc. German historians of the Teutonic Order note with satisfaction that by this bull, the Teutonic Order was provided for a long time ahead with a broad plan of action. The order was henceforth to be the bearer of the mission of expansion, which according to the Carolingian tradition was the very essence of empire. End quote. Let me close these pop-ups. This charter bears disturbing implications in our times. For now, let's continue with the Teutonic Order's role in setting up this breed of empire unique in its time. Though they gave up on competing with the Templars and the Hospitallers in the Holy Land, the Order did well with crusades in their home territory. Still, the emperor had far-reaching ideas. Winkler writes, and I quote, Frederick II, the emperor who dreamed of world dominion, had given the order an impetus which was to keep its full force for many centuries. The knights began the campaign with the firm resolve to keep for their order exclusively all conquered territory, and to expand their conquests far beyond the lands of Kulm and Prussia, end quote. Winkler sees a cold-hearted, all-business campaign waged by the Teutonic Knights to a self-serving end. Quoting Winkler, the object of the campaign was to secure more and more territory for the order. To succeed in this, any means would do, and any excuse was valid for waging war against peaceful neighboring princes, even those who were Christian, if their land were coveted. In the 13th century, the characteristic Russo-Teutonic methods were already definitely crystallized. End quote. Frederick II especially enjoyed the Dominus Mundi part of his titles. His personal sense of grandeur justified the use of the church in the self-serving missions to which he assigned the Teutonic Knights. Frederick was curiously a spiritually minded man, rather mystical even. At least he elevated the dedication which he showed his objectives, go to the next page, and demanded of the order's knights to a mystical intensity. Winkler adds, quoting, what mattered was the very existence of a secret. Men bound by a common secret, subject to the same vow of silence on certain questions, were likely to devote themselves more ardently and with steadier zeal to the common cause than if they were bound by purely rational obligations devoid of mystery. End quote. That sounds like the secrecy, the bad secrecy that JFK was talking about not long before he died. End quote on the Winkler there. Lest today's reader miss this essential and revealing point, Winkler further emphasizes, and I quote, Modern society has greatly neglected this helpful factor, so very important in the Middle Ages and ancient times. Frederick II, whose mystical soul divined what he could expect from the closed organization of an order built on mystic vows and a secret, firmly intended to use them in carrying out his plans. End quote. Because those plans were so vital to his vision of empire, Frederick II relied heavily upon the Teutonic Order to force them, and thus determined to bestow upon it status equal to independent statehood. Winkler points out that the Bull of Rimini is clear evidence of this. Another aspect of these events is that of identity. Frederick II could not be considered an authentic German nationalist. Winkler writes, quoting Winkler, Frederick II was German only on his father's side. His mother was Constance of Sicily, and the education he received in his own youth was much more Sicilian than German. He was a sort of Renaissance figure before the Renaissance. But Frederick, in achieving his imperialistic plans, had met with more difficulties in Italy than in Germany. Although the German princes were often not easy to handle, he still had a greater hold on the German nobles than on the Italian. In view of this, the Teutonic Order, which was an organization of German noblemen, was able to bring him valuable help, especially because of his sincere friendship with the order's Grand Master. End quote. Winkler argues that Frederick II wasn't committed to German nationalism at all. Rather, he was seeking to establish a new corporate identity with its own traditions. He was seeking to establish a new corporate identity with its own traditions. Breakaway, kind of? I'll continue. In the Bull of Rimini, Frederick identifies as Emperor of the Romans, King of Jerusalem and of Sicily. Extending the Roman Empire was his mystical quest. He mentioned not a word of German lands. Frederick II considered his imperial Carolingian title too small. His personal vision was Dominus Mundi, to rule the world. His use of the church and good graces of the Pope would not withstand the mystical nature of his self-realization and the crusade it fueled. Quoting Winkler, in his youth, he appeared to be a faithful son of the church. Moreover, he owed his election as emperor to the sponsorship of the Pope. But his faith was not to evolve along very orthodox lines, and he was often accused of skepticism with regard to church doctrine. He was much interested in astrology and the occult sciences, which he had learned from the Saracens in Sicily, the home of his mother. Frederick was finally excommunicated. End quote. Frederick II would spend much of the second half of his life chasing absolute power, even against the interests of the church, so much so that some considered him an anti-Christian force. Though Italy and Germany suffered under his reign, the Teutonic Order did not. The knights were set up rather comfortably thanks to the emperor. Quoting Winkler, like its spiritual ancestor, it too was to become the hammer of the world and the scourge of the peoples. And the description of Frederick II, what he required at that moment and what might be useful as a weapon, were now considered right, can equally and unreservedly be applied to the order. It was Frederick II who instructed the order in the strict methods used by the Normans of Sicily in organizing the state. The order's entire setup of knight officials, which was to be the basis of the severe Prussian official system, which sprang from there. End quote. The Teutonic Order would continue enforcing Frederick II's vision of a new state with its distinct corporate culture. The pretense, falsity, the pretense of religious conversion would go by the wayside, for the knights would much prefer to keep the heathens pagan. The knights would much prefer to keep the heathen pagans in order to enslave them with impunity. Oh, okay. Sorry, I misread my own sentence. For the knights would much prefer to keep the heathens pagan in order to enslave them with impunity. Sorry. Don't bitch, you're getting this for free. By 1283, their conquest was complete, and that is when the mainstream history dictates that we are to believe it coincidental, the idea of a unified state culture for German lands emerged. Quoting Winkler, a vigorous and systematic colonization of the land by German peasants was effected. At the same time, this network of cities was extended, no longer for defense needs only, but also for administrative purposes. End quote. Winkler points out that the methods used by the Teutonic Order in the 13th century to carry out this new state vision are identical to those used by the Nazis in the 20th century. More on this later to be certain. The overall point Winkler makes of the history of the order's drifting away from the religious nature of its original crusading camouflage is that the knights carried out their mandate on an authority separate from that of the law of the land at the time. They were operating under their own personal laws. This is my addition. Separate from that of the law of the land at the time. In other words, like we have constitutional law and such, imagine an organization wanting to follow the laws of its own personal vision. I will continue. The Teutonic Order functioned according to its own rules with its own aims, seeing itself justified by an altogether different objective and authority than the rest of the world. And it sought to make the world in its own image. Quoting Winkler, the order therefore regarded itself thenceforth not only as bearer but also as sole heir of that mission which it had been assigned by the Germano-Roman emperors. End quote. With no power in the German lands to stop them, the Teutonic Knights became the judge, executioner, and slave masters over the authentic Prussians. Gee, I wonder if they wore masks and used administrative warrants. If the pagans did not submit, they were slaughtered. In other words, if you weren't in the prescribed faith or church, you were slaughtered. Those who were forced to give up their cultural traditions, including their language. Wait a minute. What was that? Let me see. Those, were slaughtered. If the pagans did not submit, they were slaughtered. Those who did submit were forced to give up their cultural traditions, including their language. Is anybody else seeing any resonance with, America today? I'm just wondering. If you're feeling it. Remember, I wrote this in 2020, published this in 2023. I'll continue. These collaborationists were forced to adopt the corporate state identity and become new Prussians. Cultural collaboration soon became intermingling with the captors, and a new class of citizen was ready to be born. Enter the Junkers. Quoting Winkler, the Germanized Borussian nobility, now married among the German beggar noblemen, Betteljunkers, who had settled in the countries of the order in the wake of the knights. Together they were to form the Prussian Junker caste. End quote. By the time the Junkers appeared on the scene, the Teutonic Order had outdone itself with extreme pursuit of conquest and control. Again, quoting Winkler, for the purpose of constantly extending their territory, the knights, on the flimsiest of pretexts, waged successive wars against all their neighbors. Successive wars. The order did not, moreover, intend to stop at any point. The tentacles of the Teutonic squid reached out ever further with insatiable avidity. In the course of centuries, the whole territory thus conquered became known as Prussia. End quote. Sowing discord wherever it suited their objectives, the Teutonic Order provoked wars among their neighbors, driving brother against brother in self-serving conflicts. Attempt at peacemaking was met with accusations of treason and derision. Undeserving collaborationists would receive favor over the authentic citizenry. Wars that broke out were the objective of the order and were lost to them, of course, ceding yet more territory to the Teutonic Knights. This was their practice over centuries. Manipulation and martial tyranny gained them whatever land they desired. The self-discipline, originally keeping the knights ethical and their baser instincts in check, was decaying until ultimately open atrocities were their hallmark. Boy, I don't know, but I just had a flash of Hegseth with his Crusader tattoos as I was reading that. Anyway, folks, if you're not prepared for my sides, this is a book I wrote and put out in 2023. Essentially, let's cut the bullshit. I was warning about what was coming, what could be coming. And unfortunately, we are seeing it. I wish I had been wrong, but I will quote Winkler again. The treatment to which the knights subjected the conquered people was, from the very beginning, most inhuman and led quite frequently to their severe condemnation by the Holy See, which at times went so far as to place them under ban. End quote. It was the perfect time for the Junker caste to make its moves in, again quoting Winkler now, a combination of actual economic interest established in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries among the followers of the knights, and which may be traced right down to our time, meaning 1937, behind its front, which has been changed frequently in the course of centuries. I'll start that again. This is Winkler. Behind its front, its false face, which has been changed frequently in the course of centuries, this combination of interests represented an important motive force for keeping alive those ideas of grandeur of the state and devotion to it, which have been propagated in Prussia from the times of the knights down to the present. Again, present in this case being World War II. I'm end quoting Winkler at the moment. Let me get rid of the pop-ups. The Junkers were more than willing to provide enthusiastic support to the objectives of the order, and especially the methods by which those objectives were enforced. Again, let's quote Winkler. Thousands of nobles soon came from various sections of Germany and settled near the knights. We can consider these nobles the second most favored of all the groups which gained by the conquest. They were, for the most part, adventurers, lured by profits to these lands where a crusader was granted every liberty. Here, these sons of noblemen, whether they had not yet come into their inheritance or had squandered them recklessly, might hope to make their fortunes in short order. For some years, they served in the armies of the order without actually taking the order's vows, kind of like mercenaries. Then, thanks to the connections they had made in the order, they were able to seize estates owned by Belarusians or by other native peoples. These adventurers arrived in the Belarusian territory without possessions, practically beggars. They were called the Betteljunker, the beggar squires. End quote on the Winkler there. I'll continue to read. The authentic Belarusian nobility, forced to Germanize, allied themselves with the opportunistic Junkers in desperate hope to maintain ownership of their estates. In other words, to keep their own, they made a deal with the devil. How many guys in the cabinet presently who vocally and openly hated Trump are now sucking his appendage and serving him? Rubio. Cruz isn't in the cabinet, but, come on, folks. Come on. See what I'm saying here. God damn it. I'll continue. Intermarriage gained some favor with the order, but this new class included defrocked friars and other less than honorable would-be elitists who were responsible for a fair amount of the atrocities committed in the Teutonic Order state. Because their service was a benefit to the order's objectives, the knights overlooked the Junker class's sins. The Junker class was not subject to the same disciplinary action which already barely kept the knights in line. These undisciplined Junkers Germanized Borussian Teutonic Order cast-offs, once established as the Prussian Junker caste, next actively sought to make themselves indispensable to the order. Okay, so they were once kind of lessers, and so they decide, how do we get power? We'll make ourselves indispensable to the Teutonic Order. Winkler speaks of two Germanys, one represented by the cities outside the direct control of the Teutonic Order. There was animosity between these two factions, and the Junkers fanned those flames in the direction of the new so-called Prussian state. Despite the strength of the cities outside that influence posing a threat to the Knights' force capabilities. Kind of sounds like states in America that just don't want to comply with the regime in D.C. I will quote Winkler again now. Here we see before us two contradictory Germanic developments which occurred independently of one another until the middle of the 19th century. The one, characterizing the greater part of Germany, was essentially Christian and formed part of what we call Western civilization. The other, proceeding in a direct line from the ambitious Germano-Roman emperors, was localized in Prussia. Representatives of the latter tendency recognized no rights but their own, and regarded with great disdain the cooperative, altruistic spirit prevailing in other German states. They described this spirit as the result of degeneration and patiently awaited the moment when they could annihilate it in their domination over the rest of Germany. Tell me that doesn't sound like the bullshit going on in the United States right now. I'm going to read that again. I put together this book, and Winkler nails it right there. This is Winkler. Remember, I'm quoting Winkler. The Prussian state guys, the bad guys, recognized no rights but those that they preferred, and regarded with great disdain the cooperative, altruistic spirit, like equality, freedom, liberty, prevailing in other German states. The Prussian assholes, I'm paraphrasing Winkler here, the others, the bad guys, okay, described this spirit of equality and all this stuff as the result of degeneration. They're degenerates, and patiently awaited the moment when they could annihilate it in their dominion over the rest of Germany. There is a movement, folks, that it has its clutches in Washington, D.C., okay, and in power, that seeks to annihilate, okay, anyone who doesn't agree with them in domination over the country. This is what Winkler says here about what was going on in medieval Germany is what's going on in the United States now, 3 years after I wrote this book. Wake up. Wake the F up. End quote Winkler. I will continue. What the opposition to the order did was form the Bund, a union of secular Prussian merchants who practice fair play in the marketplace. The other cities opposed to the Prussian states of the order, exhausted with the corruption and abuse suffered under the order's knights. Think of the order as Heritage Foundation, okay? With the corruption and abuse suffered under the order's knights, founded the Hanseatic League, combined the League and the Bund made their stand. But in 1453, the emperor backed the knights, and within a year, the Bund went to war with the order. For the first time, the Teutonic Knights were faced with an adversary with greater power, and this seriously concerned them. For 13 years, the war battered both sides deeply. The Teutonic Order started the conflict with 71,000 men, but ended up with a mere 1,700 by the time the treaty was signed at Thorn in 1466. Basically, the Bund, the side of secular freedom, kicked the Order's ass. Just saying. It should be inspiring to us now. Just keep that in mind. The Order was defeated, humiliated. Kulm, Michelau, Pomerania Minor, with their principal cities of Thorn, Danzig, Elbing, Marienburg, all fell to Polish rule. The master of the order was reduced to a Duke of Poland. Only Frederick von Hohenzollern showed support for the order, and this pact was so strong that a descendant, Albert von Hohenzollern, became master of the Teutonic Order in 1511 AD. Thus it was under the leadership of Albert that the order's territory was secularized and became the Duchy of Prussia, an official hereditary state. With this act by Albert, the Junkers at last found themselves on the level with their heretofore masters, the knights. At last the time had come for the Junkers to deal their hand. So you see in the defeat of the order, who, were really carrying out the vision of the Junkers and the Prussians. In their defeat, still the Junkers gain advantage. They are duplicitous. You'll learn more about that. You'll see that whatever happens to the puppets they're using, they play it to come out on top. I'll continue reading. After gaining favor and intermarrying with and making themselves vital to the Knights class, the Junkers proceeded to execute maneuvers designed to betray the Knights. Thus was formed the Society of Lizards. Back in 1397, the Eidigungsgesellschaft was founded as a secret Junkers society. Lampens had this to say in 1904, quoting Lampens, "The Landjunkers, in their inconsiderate exploitation of the peasantry, faced constant obstacles from the officers of the order, the Teutonic Order. Now, a section of the Landjunkers formed an apparently harmless, but actually most treacherous association. The Eidigungsgesellschaft, claiming, as it is often said today, that its purpose was the protection of its own interests. According to the secret rules of this association, the Landjunkers were to support patriotic German interests only if this were to their own advantage. And already at that time, they found their advantage only in the ruin of the rest of humanity. The entire country existed for them alone, to be exploited and abused by them." End quote. The Society of Lizards would be the mechanism by which the Junkers would ultimately betray the Teutonic Order. Though their charter paid lip service to the Grand Masters, their actions reflect just the opposite, always declaring that any action they deemed an injustice would invoke their right to take defensive action. The Junkers would succeed in removing the order from Prussia through usurping state power. I want to go back to the sentence I wrote. Always declaring that any action they deemed an injustice would invoke their right to take defensive action. That's very narcissistic, isn't it? Always claiming that no matter what somebody does, someone could give you a flower and you could claim it's an affront and therefore you have a right to destroy them or take your defensive action. You get to define what the person did, and therefore you get to define, you get to just write off whatever treachery you do because you're defending yourself. It's kind of like if you criticize someone of a particular tradition, you're called an anti of that tradition, right? even if they deserve the criticism. Oh, you're this, you just hate so and so. That's kind of what that is. Might even be the origin of that crap. I don't know. I'll continue. One of the Society of Lizards' successes was no doubt Albert von Hohenzollern's decision to reduce the Teutonic Order to a mere duchy. Henceforth, the Junkers became the masters of the Prussian state. Let me see. Okay, yeah. Quoting Winkler again, if this state, by virtue of an ancient tradition, was destined to carry forward a world mission, they intended to execute this mission, since they themselves were now to be the beneficiaries of all advantages. End quote. So through their maneuvering and treachery, the Junkers control the state. I'll read on. Just as the Teutonic Order established its hospital as a front for self-interest of their caste, the Junkers would also adopt a self-serving yet more duplicitous agenda. Quoting Winkler, from the time of its founding, the order had a secret or secrets. These secrets are mentioned frequently, and in the rules of the Grand Master Conrad von Ehrlichshausen, it is clearly stated that the order's secrets must never be revealed before laymen or before the servants. This cannot be a reference to the order's statutes, as they were known to everyone. The secrets, then, can concern only a more detailed statement of the aims of expansion and conquest than was originally contained in the intentionally vague Bull of Rimini. Continuing the quote of Winkler, it is this double motive which explains the pursuit in a most ruthless manner of a mad plan for imperialism by the impersonal entity which was the order, and which today is the state. This general interest shouldered out all private interests except where the interests of the German nobility were concerned, or rather of those German nobles who in the course of centuries had come to form the caste of Prussian Junkers. Their welfare was the supreme yet rarely acknowledged goal of the order. The same double purpose which was pursued centuries ago by the order is carried on today by the Junker organizations. Today meaning 1937 Germany. The secrets were the same in the 13th as in the 20th century. End quote. I'll read on. As the Teutonic Knights themselves conserved their titles and functions within the order, the Junkers guarded and exercised the privileges that increased their own power. Beneath the surface, the Society of Lizards maintained the mystical conspiracy practiced by both castes. The state industry was warfare, pure and simple, and the Junkers were committed to a principle that conflict would result in Junker hegemony, or there would be no peace. Folks, Winkler, in this history, I was just reading what I wrote, but essentially what this is saying is these are the guys who created, the concept of the modern military-industrial complex. I'm gonna repeat that. This is from my writing, not quoting Winkler. The state industry was warfare, pure and simple, and the Junkers were committed to a principle that conflict would result in Junker hegemony or there would be no peace. Sound familiar? Despite the abuses by both the Knights class and the Junkers caste, the feudal class was always there to support either, and thus the Junkers survived any shallow scrutiny. The feudal class. So that kind of sounds like our congressmen, right? Our politicians, they're and the wealthy, they're gonna, golly, they're gonna support the assholes and thus keep them in power. I'll continue. The Junkers had found their model of power, the military-industrial complex, and they were willing to demonstrate their power through violent enforcement. Enter the FEMA. A manner of secret society, the FEMA established itself in all manners as a tribunal, judges and executioners. During the early decades of the 20th century, there were multiple political murders in Germany. Bavarian deputy Karl Gerres prepared a file of his investigation, but after communicating his intent to reveal what he had found, Gerres was shot dead on a public street, himself another victim of the politically motivated assassinations. Winkler writes, quoting Winkler, "The two men who participated in his assassination escaped and were never apprehended. In any case, we know this much, that Gerres had spoken of a conspiracy going back 1,000 years, which he intended to reveal. He must have been referring to one of the only two German organizations which stem from the Middle Ages, the FEMA and the Teutonic Order." End quote. Though the Knights claimed to have been independent of the FEMA, it appears that the order was still subject to the FEMA's reach. Even the Grand Master was suspected of association with the dreaded cabal. Quoting again Winkler, "One morning, two knights who were beyond reproach were found hanging from an oak tree outside Marienburg and marked by the FEMA." Oh, that was quoting Kotzebue, scholar. "The Grand Master was asked to prosecute the murderers. He did nothing. The others, enraged, again requested action from him, and now he declared in dead earnest, one should abstain from passing judgment on such things." End quote. In other words, the man who could do something about it said, leave it alone. Okay? And that was Winkler quoting Kotzebue. I will continue. The FEMA was a throwback to the feudal era. The Westphalian practice of manorial rights, lords over serfs, was its basis. From this emerged the secret death tribunal, a pagan entity and concept which masqueraded as a wholly Christian body. This religious facade, also used by the Teutonic Order to great effect, was a means by which the FEMA and the order could resist the old Roman law, which was the basis of German justice, authentic justice. Again, quoting Winkler, "The existence of the FEMA was known, but its operations were secret. It was subject to no authority except the emperors. The latter, at a time not clearly defined in German history, had delegated this authority to the Archbishop of Cologne, who was head of the FEMA, at least nominally. Indeed, the FEMA tribunal had among its principal official tasks the punishment of crimes against religion, but in practice, its activity was entirely different." End quote. You guys should see the same themes of games going on now. "The truth was that the FEMA was the hand of terror applied to anyone that dare oppose them and their interests." I wonder if they wore masks. "The cloak of Christianity served to convince the rest of Christian Europe and Western civilization in general that the FEMA and the Teutonic Order represented medieval devotion to the church, which was far from the truth in practice. Tribunals of the medieval FEMA were held in Westphalia, but the organization claimed jurisdiction throughout Germany. The families involved claimed this power was a privilege bestowed upon them by Charlemagne himself, and that proceedings must be held on the Red Earth, i.e. Westphalia. The chief member of the tribunals led other jurors who were also conveniently hangmen, literal executioners. These jurors comprised the Frischhofen and served as the enforcement and punishment apparatus of the FEMA. There were 100,000 of them across Germany, but they used mystery to their advantage." Quoting Winkler, "The Frischhofen kept their functions absolutely secret, identifying each other by secret signs. But even if they were not recognized by the average citizens, everyone knew that they managed to lay hands on their victims wherever they might be hiding. Its occult aspect contributed largely to increasing the terror which the FEMA inspired over all of Germany. End damn quote. Its occult aspect, hidden aspect, contributed largely to increasing the terror. Now, when you have so-called agents running around wearing masks, that's hidden identities. That increases the terror. Sound familiar? I'm tired of the people that say, "Oh, you're misinterpreting. Oh, it doesn't mean that." It's time to grow up. These Frischhofen could accuse anyone in private tribunal sessions, and the FEMA could pass sentence without the accused even being present to defend himself. In fact, the accused began simply to not bother trying, noting that the FEMA passed only the death sentence and knowing that the FEMA passed only the death sentence and one's word against their juror executioners was useless. So you were going to get death every time. An original requirement need only present 2 witnesses on behalf of the accused was subsequently tripled, simply to ensure difficulty in gaining acquittal. From there, it evolved into an even more ridiculous process, all designed to ensure conviction in spite of the facts. In spite of the facts, your conviction was ensured. If the defendant did brave an appearance, the inevitable death sentence would be carried out immediately. No chance nor hope for an appeal. As much of this process as possible was held in secret. Though given jurisdiction over a wide range of crimes, those of most interest and concern to the FEMA related to a simple confrontation or conflict with its members. Betrayal of trust with their secrets. Betrayal of trust with their secrets being the worst offense, the punishments were violent and made a statement. Even the suspicion that an outsider was trying to gain access to their secrets was punishable by death. FEMA documents hundreds of years old remain sealed in German archives out of fear of its reach. Okay, I'm going to read that again. FEMA documents, hundreds of years old to this day, remain sealed in German archives out of fear that it can still get to you. Does this sound familiar? Documents about the JFK assassination still remaining secret. The Epstein files still remaining secret. People afraid to release this stuff because they might come get them. This should all sound familiar, and as we approach the World War II era, it will become obvious. Remember, for those of you who are just here, people in the live chat, catch them up. I'm reading my book from 2023, and I'm in the part where Paul Winkler's comparing, revealing what was going on in Germany in 1937 by looking at the history of Germany. And in this book, my point is to show how it continued into the United States. This should all sound familiar, and as we approach the World War II era, it will become obvious. But before we get there, the treachery of the secret hand behind the Junkers and the FEMA must be noted. The day upon which this secret society, the aforementioned Society of Lizards, exercised its coup was at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410 AD. Among the Teutonic Knights were numbered those who had been turned agents of the Eidex and Gesellschaft, and one of those was the standard bearer of the Kulmlin banner who rolled up the flag in the sign of retreat. Now, the standard bearer of the Teutonic Knights had become a double agent for the Society of Lizards against his own order. Okay? And his instruction was to roll the flag up in the sign of retreat. The massive opposing force was given time to set upon the knights. Though the castle was successfully defended against the siege, the majority of the officers were killed or captured on the field. It was a decisive blow to the order's power. It would never really recover after that. Now, basically, the wrong signal was sent so that the most of the order could be slaughtered in that battle. Fallen into immoral treachery over the years, the Teutonic Order had left itself open to the insidious rise of the Junkers within its own walls, and the mysterious Society of Lizards had found its crack in the fortress through the Junkers. This would be its model for future conquest of the world. But who exactly were the Lizards? What was the Society of Lizards really all about? No one has ever answered that question. What sources there are claim an altruistic motivation while at the same time admitting that the society harbored a deep secret. No one has ever uncovered that secret. Some assume it merely involved an internal power struggle. Others suggest that some members shifted their allegiance to the Junkers. But the Lizards' dedication to establishment of an autonomy within territory claimed by the new Prussian culture, their deep secret remaining secure. After the defeat of the Teutonic Knights, the Junkers renegotiated with the new landlords of territories lost, using the opportunity to expand their vision of their conquest. This new Prussia would serve the Society of Lizards well. Proceeding under the Polish landlords, whom they considered only temporary masters, the Junkers embraced their new alliance with the Lizard Society, and together these two malicious forces slithered onward, possibly to form the breakaway society that appears to have nearly conquered the free world. It would be during the 19th century that the Prussian monster would emerge to facilitate the NYMZA plan. Who were they? I propose that the answer originates with the question, who are the Society of Lizards? For this answer, we must look to the long pursuit of the lost technology of the forgotten civilizations, specifically from that of the 15th to 19th century. And that involves the even murkier history of the far past of this world. Okay, we're at chapter 3. I'm going to take a quick break. I hope you guys are liking this. So let me just take a quick break. I'll be right back. Stay there, Mike. Okay. Thanks, Brian. The keen Walter mind. The madman. Different lizards. Okay, folks, I'm up to chapter 3. Hell, I can't even remember how many chapters are in this book. It's a short book, and I got to tell you, it was not enjoyable to write. Nope, get rid of the pop-up. Okay. Chapter 3. Who are the lizards? It's difficult to pinpoint the exact answer to that question. Who came first, NYMZA or the lizards, i.e., the group behind the Eidechs and Gesellschaft? Clearly, the latter is an iteration of the German tongue, so the Society of Lizards, as such, is the more recent body. But there had to be so-called lizards to form said society. I have long suspected that the mysterious ancient NYMZA are represented here. That is to say, that I think whomever and whatever the ancient NYMZA may be or have been, they are the so-called lizards of whom we speak within our context of this secretive medieval group. Therefore, we must first answer, who is NYMZA? I have explored the identity of the shadowy NYMZA in multiple volumes of research. What I've put forth so far is the following. Starting with Charles Delchau, the original and sole independent source on the word, we have NYMZA, NYMZA, being the secretive group based in Brandenburg and being identified with a Prussian officer. Delchau also tells us that NYMZA is a group well enough resourced to sponsor in some unspecified capacity the development of exotic technologies by smaller groups located in multiple regions of the United States, specifically as early as the 1850s. Delchau also reveals a rift between NYMZA and the Sonora Aero Club regarding objectives for use of said technology, the desire of NYMZA being bellicose and reflective of what we know of the Prussian culture as characterized by its Junker lizard history. Both the nature of the exotic technology Delchau describes being developed mid-19th century and the players identified by him reveal suggestions as to the validity of the story on points impossible to have been recognized prior to 1971, the year Delchau's discarded journals were found by Pete Navarro in Texas, the state where Delchau spent much of his life and died. In my attempt to further identify NYMZA, a hypothetical translation is offered in Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora. Taking into account Delchau's own description of the organization as headquartered in Germany, specifically Brandenburg, it seemed most logical to me to take the context of Delchau's story into account as well, and thus I offer the following. Now, I had help with this, okay? I am not a German linguist, but what was suggested to me based on how I extrapolated things was the following. NYMZA equals, again, folks, this is hypothetical, so nobody gets your damn panties in a bunch, all right? Breathe through the nose. NYMZA, the Nationalistische Jagdflugzeug Maschinen Sammlungsamt. In the American English vernacular, it would be expressed as the Nationalist Pursuit Recon Airship Program Office. It is important to note that it's nationalist, not national. A very crucial distinction in understanding the organization from this hypothetical perspective. There was no unified German nation during the period about which Delchau writes of NYMZA. There was however, a nationalist movement behind which the modern Prussian faction, aka the Junkers Lizards, was firmly the driving force. I stand by this speculative translation as a worthier attempt at identifying NYMZA than any before it or since, as of this writing. But it may not end there. As contextual as my NYMZA offering may be to the Del Shao account of the Sonora Aero Club and the subsequent 1890s airship mystery, we may have, next page, a somewhat hieroglyphic nature to the curious word NYMZA used by Del Shao. As considered by author Sechery, deeper etymological and esoteric analysis reveals yet more meaning that suggests a possible connection to the deep secret of the Society of Lizards. In my 2014 book, Empire of the Wheel 3, The Nameless Ones, Hari points out that the etymological elements of the word NYMZA tell the real story, and that the organization of which Del Shao speaks is a homonym crafted with dual purpose to mask its true masters. So again, who am I quoting here? Oh, okay. I'm referring to my book, Empire of the Wheel 3, The Nameless Ones. It's all about the ancient gods that once ruled the earth. They weren't human. They were different kinds of creatures. They were amphibian. The Sumerians called these fishmen gods Anunnaki, heavenly ones fallen to earth. This is from Sechery, his analysis. So I just quoted Sechery. Hari further relates that these beings fought a war among themselves, and the losing side, evil ones, were banished to another plane of existence. These banished ones were referred to as Nym, NYM, or Hu, for they were forbidden to be identified, officially forgotten. Their place of banishment was like a cellar, and their movement was constricted in a sort of living death or sleep. Hari cites that Za, Z-A, in Egyptian, refers to cut, and applied to these beings specifically referred to the cutting of their nym, or names. Identity is a key, and the removal of their names took that key away from the defeated Anunnaki. NYMZA is like the demonic legion of the Bible, says Hari. Thus we have NYMZA, or identity is cut, or nameless ones. But that's not even where it ends, for within Hari's full analysis, we find that these nameless ones are constricted and sleep in the cellar of their prison. Where might sleeping amphibious beings be imprisoned? The sea, says Hari. You know, what comes to my mind, I'll pause here, is the so-called mystery of Antarctica and the great evil that was found there. I don't know, so think about that. I'll continue. The sea, says Hari, nameless ones asleep at the bottom of their oceanic sepulcher, which ought to sound familiar by now to Lovecraft scholars, for that is exactly what Hari thinks NYMZA are, the elder gods from the stars whose priest Cthulhu serves as psychic puppet master to minions among humanity. Or so someone may want us to believe. It could serve well the purpose of an elite bent on domination to convince the mass of humanity that they are special, something apart from and more powerful than common people. This is essentially what royals of the world's monarchies do, where the blue blood idea came from. The whole idea of a separate bloodline, a separate race of beings, could merely be an intimidation ploy to gain and keep control over a given population. In fact, just the mere suggestion that a select group communicates directly with these special beings is enough for many to bow down. That's exactly what religious priesthoods use, the claim to be closer to the gods. But what if the truth lies somewhere in between? Suppose there are people who simply came from somewhere else and by virtue of a technology more advanced than ours, established a dominance over us. They could be otherworldly in a literal sense, i.e., simply from another planet. Some say that the Yahweh figure of scriptures was just that, a military governor who came here and set himself up as a god. Such a character and his retinue could easily have been among those Anunnaki soldiers on the losing side of the aforementioned cosmic war. Another possibility might even be that the Yahweh character and his retinue were sent to find the fugitive Anunnaki, the winning side hunting the losing side, as it were. There is lore to support that idea, specifically the Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha myths. Better yet, there are the biblical so-called fallen angels who came to Earth and taught humanity the technologies of civilization. Remember, folks, I wrote all this in 2023, and people have been saying this for years. This kind of ideas are starting to be bandied about more. In the Sumerian myths, that is what happens. Two factions of the gods have a conflict because one loves humanity and wants to free them from the slavery of the other faction, interested only in humans as slaves. In other ancient traditions, this conflict is depicted as two advanced civilizations at war involving the beings from other worlds. This conflict, being the story of Atlantis or the epic of the Rama Empire, could provide insight into an alternate ancient history than the narrative we are usually fed. One doesn't need to accept stories of god beings or other worlds to consider rationally that a civilization wielding advanced technology might certainly inspire legends of gods and otherworldly beings. Someone in the halls of authority takes the idea seriously that there has been a quest for the lost technology of the forgotten civilizations throughout recorded history. I propose that we will find who the NYMZA actually were and are within the annals and alleyways of known history, and the lore and legends will offer clues. We will best achieve this by pulling the threads of the Junkers and Lizard Society members. The Junkers can be traced to the Huns via Westphalia, and that connection leads to Scythia via the Uradel and the Lesser Edelfrey, classes of higher nobility, both of ancient lineage dating back prior to 1400 AD, though Uradels were those who could prove it. Through the Scythians, among their ancestors, we may best be able to connect with the Junker, Uradels, and Edelfreys to the mysterious origin of the Lizard Society in that remote past of the lost technologies. This is where the legendary Shining Ones may enter the discussion, for the ancestors of the Huns were the Scythians, and their contemporary Ubaid culture, predating Sumeria by 2,000 years, depicted a superior culture as humans with lizard heads. Let me say that again. They depicted a superior culture as humans with lizard heads. The origin, it doesn't mean they actually had lizard heads, folks. The origin of the Ubaids themselves is unknown. Do these reptilian-headed human figures represent the secret of the Anunnaki, the Shining Ones? Scholars have found the settlement of Anu was on the North Caspian Sea and believe it was they who introduced the Anunnaki to the Sumerians, not the other way around. I suspect in these Ubaid reptilian figures, we have the deepest clue as to the identity of an ancient race that came from somewhere else. I propose they ingratiated themselves within the Scythians and positioned themselves through the ages to the Huns and then to the medieval Prussian Junker Germans. It appears to have been their model, which the Junkers practiced. It appears to have been their model, which the Junkers practiced, that passive, duplicitous conquest. In these Ubaid figures, represented with reptilian heads, I say we have our nameless ones, the earliest suspects for the hand behind the older, more mysterious NYMZA. Just as the Prussian Junkers, Nazi Germans, have been using us, the Ubaid lizards, whomever and whatever they are, have been using them. Chapter 4, New World. The Bull of Rimini, as stated in the previous chapters, the central problem where Prussian-German activities in the Americas are concerned. The often discussed maps, charts, and portolans, allegedly from a murky period in history, likely informed this action by Pope Innocent III on behalf of his Holy Roman Imperial cohorts. The knowledge of the supposedly unknown Americas, apparently of advanced technical precision for its time, certainly inspired a grand global quest for riches and power. The Fourth Crusade was conducted between 1202 and 1204 AD between the crusading armies from France, German states, and Venice against the Eastern Roman Empire and Hungary, both interestingly allied with the Venetians as well. The legendary Knights Templar refused to directly engage in the invasion and conquest of Constantinople, stopping at mere logistical support. Let me close the knowledge of the Americas suspiciously began to emerge following this crusade, many scholars proposing that the aforementioned cartography revealing said New World was captured from the Imperial Archive at Constantinople, which is known to have held much the same items and artifacts as could be found in the Library of Alexandria, itself infamously sacked more than once centuries prior. How the Bull of Rimini takes advantage of this captured knowledge of the New World is described very well by Paul Winkler, quoting Winkler, "A permanent charter for all Prussian conquest and all German political expansion, which during centuries to come and until this day," 1937 in his case, "was to radiate from that territory. The uncompromising spirit with which the Teutonic Order pursued its aim sprang from the imperial mission which was entrusted to the order in this Bull of Rimini. The pretext of a religious mission justified such purposes. This is, in fact, the very origin of the secular conflict between popes and emperors. Frederick specified that his mission of empire was directed not less to subjugation than to conversion of the people. This phrase, moreover, is a clear indication of the methods by which the order was to carry out the imperial mission entrusted to it by the bull." Thank you, guys. If what this book, by the end of it, is saying regarding a post-World War II Nazi infiltration in the United States through Junkers style, by ingratiating itself through Operation Paperclip. Remember, Operation Paperclip was the idea of the Germans, not Americans. Don't get your history wrong, okay? So if the influence is there, the Christian nationalists are the puppets that are hell-bent on the conversion of the people. Okay, anyway, that's a side. I'll get back to that later. Not less to subjugation than conversion of the people. This phrase, moreover, is a clear indication of the methods by which the order was to carry out the imperial mission entrusted to it by the bull. The bull states that in this spirit, and by virtue of the invitation of Duke of Conrad of Masovia, the Teutonic Order is charged with conquering the territory described, intentionally, no doubt, in very vague terms. The order shall enjoy the old and due imperial rights over mountains, plains, rivers, forests, and seas. In other words, the rest of the friggin' globe. End quote on Winkler there. The comment about the friggin' globe, that was mine. Looking back on this with 21st century perspective, especially in consideration of Nazi Germany's overt association with South America and all the post-war evidence of some Nazi organizational survival, Winkler's assessment appears disturbingly spot on. It also makes sense of all known historical presence and activities of Prussian German individual and corporate in the Americas dating back to colonial times. Additionally, there is the eerie resonance between the Bull of Rimini and the more arcane claims of Delschau and his storied presence of the mysterious NYMZA. It could be said that if there was a focused pursuit of the sneakier aspects and objectives of the Bull, NYMZA is our best candidate for agency of that global imperial objective implied by Pope Innocent's wording. Since we are here concerned with the conquest of the United States, we shall keep our sights on target. Colonial America was of interest to the pre-unification states of Germany. By the time of the American Revolution, there was divided interest. Hessian, Prussian, troops fought for the British Army and were feared by most. Yet in 1781, Prussian states defied the British by signing on to the League of Armed Neutrality to protect American merchant shipping rights from the Royal Navy. When it came to combat, Prussian states differed on to where and whether or not they sent soldiers. Famously, Baron von Steuben joined Washington's army and was instrumental in transforming the force. And many of the German soldiers who fought in the conflict remained in the newly founded United States after it was over. From the perspective of Winkler's take on the Bull of Rimini, was all of this so organic? Did all Prussian soldiers choose to remain in the Americas simply because they liked it better than life back in Europe? Or might some of them have been linked to a centuries-old plan to pursue the vague charter of the Bull of Rimini in this new world? Might the conquest of the United States have its roots in the participation of Prussians in the very founding of the nation? We might find clues in otherwise mundane activities of Prussian Germans in the Americas, activities that could have actually been in support of said conquest, a la the Pope's clever charter, according to Winkler. Consider scientific exploration, specifically geographic and archaeological. For example, there is Alexander von Humboldt, born in 1769 and educated at Frankfurt and Göttingen. A county in California is named in his honor. Humboldt's explorations of America began in 1799 in Venezuela. From there, he traversed the Amazon, the Orinoco River, Peru, Cartagena, and resulted in the foundation of modern geography. It resulted in the foundation of modern geography and meteorology. Yet another aspect of Humboldt's work was geology, which could hint at the hunt for gold sources. Curiously, Humboldt himself suspected vast subterranean spaces in his geological data, which might suggest an early source, perhaps, for Nazi Hollow Earth theory. There were other Prussian-German scientists commissioned by Prince Clemens von Metternich to the Austrian expedition to Brazil between 1817 to 1835, an expedition linked to Dom Pedro IV of Brazil, himself the descendant of the monarch associated with the fascinating manuscript 512. It should be noted that Metternich was exiled for a time, during which he resided in both central banker havens, Amsterdam and London, and then spent the summer of 1851 with Otto von Bismarck. One could argue that the Brazilian expedition, commissioned by Metternich, was dedicated to serving the charter of the Bull of Rimini. Heinrich von Langsdorff explored the Minas Gerais region of Amazonian Brazil, so famously linked to lost city lore. Supposedly lost for 100 years, Langsdorff's notes, when eventually found, revealed a focus on geography and ethnography, disciplines of keen importance to the search for lost civilizations and forgotten cultures. Such knowledge could well serve the Teutonic Charter, per the Bull of Rimini. Robert Herman Schomburgk, an honored servant of England for his fieldwork in the Virgin Islands and British Guiana, commissioned by the Royal Geographic Society, also happened to be a Knight of the Prussian Order of the Red Eagle, usually only awarded to commissioned officers. In this capacity, Schomburgk fits the bill of a double agent. Humboldt's brother Wilhelm was a Knight First Class of the Red Eagle. Additionally, a Prussian diplomat in the service of Dom Pedro II of Brazil, the monarch linked directly to the manuscript 512 Lost City tableau, was a Grand Cross Knight. Are we really to dismiss any suspicions that Prussian operatives may have been seeking to identify new territories and resources under the Charter of Conquest issued to them by Pope Innocent's Bull of Rimini? I say we should be highly suspicious. No, I didn't want to do that. Okay, there we go. Karl Bondensteinem, a psychiatrist who focused on the anthropology of cultures of central Brazil. August Kapler, a naturalist who explored Suriname for 33 years. Journalist explorer Hugo Zoller, geographer Wilhelm Sievers, and naval officer archaeologist Arthur Poznansky. All these men were major explorers of South American territories and sites through the 19th century, and they are among those we know about. Anyone, if not all of them, were in the position to serve the Teutonic Charter of Conquest as interpreted by Paul Winkler from the Bull of Rimini. In my opinion, this single document suggests exactly what Prussian, then German agents were doing on geographical, archaeological, geological, and anthropological expeditions in the Americas. They were identifying desired territories for subsequent claim. Did it work? Has the Bull of Rimini been honored and submitted to by governments of the various nations of the Americas? Has the United States acquiesced to the alleged Teutonic Conquest Charter? German territorial claims in the New World actually date back to the 16th century with Venezuela and the Caribbean. Because of debts owed by Spain, Carlos V ceded Venezuela to the Welser banking family of Augsburg, who themselves were bankers to the Habsburg dynasty and the Holy Roman Emperor Carlos. How convenient. The Welsers commissioned conquistador Ambrosius Ehinger led the colony in search for the golden city of El Dorado while he was down there. Ehinger qualifies as a suspect for condottieri, or knight, and would have made a likely suspect for service to the Bull of Rimini. By the way, the condottieri I talk about in other books, and that is very likely Hidalgo, Knight of the Blood, or Templar. In the late 17th century, the Brandenburgisch Afrikanische Company leased a trading post on St. Thomas from the Dutch West India Guinea Company, who subsequently took it back by force. There were other attempts to colonize Tobago and also Guyana. Despite the failures, Prussian-German presence in South America and the Caribbean, dating back centuries, placed potential agents of the Teutonic Order where they needed to be to follow in the footsteps of their duplicitous political ancestry. Prussian-German colonization in South America didn't seem to take permanent hold until the 19th century. Colonia Tovar in Venezuela was founded in 1846. Pozuzo, a village in the Pasco region of Peru, was established in 1859 when the Peruvian president, Castilla, contracted Prussian traveler Kuno Damian von Scholzholzhausen to bring 10,000 German immigrants to the region to encourage the building of a railroad. Schutz managed to recruit a few hundred, but it worked. The Prussian and Tyrolean immigrants crossed the Andes and established their villages, families, and single males receiving several hectares of land each. Interestingly, the Prussian immigrants would subsequently separate themselves from the Tyroleans. Prussian immigration into Chile started earlier when in 1846, Bernard Philippi and German diplomatic consul Ferdinand Flint, already in Valparaiso, established a colony of 9 Prussian-German families on Isla Venezuela, now Isla Teja, in Valdivia. Philippi would continue bringing Prussian-German immigrants to Chile until 1852, when he was killed by natives. Much of the remainder of Prussian-German colonization of South America happened in the second half of the 19th century, mostly following unification and establishment of Germany. Nueva Germania in Paraguay, Blumenau in Brazil, Ojapampa in Peru, and the legendary San Carlos de Bariloche in Argentina among them. Carlos Wiederhold Pivanka, wealthy son of Prussian immigrants and consul to the German Empire, was the founder of Bariloche. Thus, another German with official ties, qualifying him to serve Teutonic Order Charter under the Bull of Rimini. Is it a surprise, therefore, that the Nazis, fleeing justice, reportedly ended up in Bariloche. We will get to that soon enough. The main point of all of this is to illustrate that any Prussian-German exploration, immigration, or industrial activities in the Americas could easily have camouflaged invasion maneuvers as conducted under a Teutonic Order interpretation of the Bull of Rimini, the papal charter that Paul Winkler believed was a license to do just that. I state for the record that I agree with Winkler on this interpretation and am convinced that the document has been and continues to be used in that spirit, particularly where said Prussian-German explorers, immigrants, and industrialists have had any type of official pedigree, be it military or other government agency or actual knighthood or association with a banking institution, but not exclusively. With the possibility of let me get rid of the pop-up before I get to this page. With the possibility of chartered conquest under papal decree here established, we next should look at how such an effort might have been organized and administered. It would likely require an organization dedicated to that aim, its sole focus being the expansion of the Teutonic Prussian Empire. It would best be an organization that encompasses exploration and industry. More specifically, technology. Such an organization would operate in virtual secrecy, free from the confines of a standard governmental agency. We have just such an outfit in the mysterious NYMZA of Delschow. Charles A. Delschow was a German, technically a Prussian, immigrant to the United States in the 1850s who claimed to have been sent to California on behalf of an organization he called NYMZA, which he claimed was the ersatz sponsor of multiple private groups secretly experimenting with arcane technologies. In the case of the group he was sent to report upon, the Sonora Aero Club, located in Tuolumne County, California, powered flight was the objective. According to Delschow, this was achieved in the 1850s. The decade before the U.S. Civil War, and a half century prior to the Wright brothers' successful flight at Kitty Hawk. The Sonora Aero Club was itself a group of mostly German immigrants with a few Italians who selected California for the purpose of avoiding too much attention. The Brandenburg-based NYMZA, however, was keenly interested in the successes of the Sonora Aero Club, so their assignment to Charles Delschow was not long followed by a visit from a Home Office representative referred to disparagingly as that Prussian officer. The founder and leader of the Sonora Aero Club was a German-born man named Peter Menace who did not appreciate NYMZA's interest in the development of military versions of the alleged flying machines. Since Delschow did not specify the extent of NYMZA's investment in the club's development of aero propulsion, we presently have no way of knowing the degree of the club's obligation to the equally mysterious Prussian agency. What we have in this association is a reportedly Prussian-based agency working discreetly, if not clandestinely, in the United States as early as the mid-19th century. And said association involved some amount of pressuring German immigrants to serve the native land's interests. In the Delschow tale of the Sonora Aero Club, we have an argument supporting Winkler's hypothesis and claims nearly a century before Winkler's book was written, over half a century before he was even born. I propose that the Delschow account of NYMZA is our first best evidence that the United States was already being sized up for the Prussian Junker-style, industrially motivated assimilation invasion, per the subsequent publication of the Thousand-Year Conspiracy. There would come other evidence. During the U.S. Civil War, German-born immigrants fought on both sides. Of over 500,000 immigrant soldiers for the Union, 23% of the entire fighting force, half of those were German-born. Of course, there were German immigrants fighting with the Confederacy, including Harris von Borch, Prussian-born officer who started his career in the Guards Cuirassiers, a cavalry unit of the Royal Prussian Army, followed by service in the Brandenburg Dragoons. The same year, history tells us that financial difficulties motivated Bork to emigrate to the Confederate States. That same year, Bork reportedly fights his way into the trust of Major General Jeb Stuart. After 2 more glory-filled years, Bork was selected by Jefferson Davis for a diplomatic mission to England. When the war ended, Bork went back to Prussia and fought in the Austro-Prussian War as a staff officer for Prince Friedrich Karl, and subsequently earned the Order of the Red Eagle. He lived in West Pomeranian Poland after that. Bork is an excellent example of the foremost Prussian-German national product being war. There was Major General Peter Osterhaus, graduate of Berlin Military Academy and veteran of the Prussian Revolution of 1848, who after the U.S. Civil War went to Lyon, France as a diplomat and made his home in Germany, where he remained. We should consider Brigadier General Felix Nepomuk, Prince of Salm-Salm, who began training as a youth in cadet school in Berlin, preparing for a military career. Prince Felix was commissioned into the Prussian 11th Hussar Regiment in 1846 and served during the 3 Years' War with Denmark. After that, he joined the Austrian army and served in the Austro-Sardinian War. Civilian life allegedly disagreed with Felix, and he emigrated to the United States conveniently long enough to serve as a staff officer to Brigadier General Louis Blenker. Also conveniently, Prince Felix was introduced to Abraham Lincoln by Prussian envoy Friedrich von Gerold. Though a fraud scandal would mar Prince Felix's American service, he still came away with command assignments until the end of the war, after which he would offer his military expertise to the Emperor Maximilian Habsburg dynasty to participate in the Mexican War against France. Subsequent to that conflict, Prince Felix would return to his home country and serve in the Prussian Fourth Guards Grenadiers, killed during the Franco-Prussian War. Though perhaps not a military genius, he was gutsy and certainly qualifies to have been an intelligence collections agent in service of Prussian long-term conquest. Finally, I offer Robert von Massow, who served with Mosby's Rangers of the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion and eventually returned to Germany to command the 9th Army Corps, and Justice Schubert, Prussian army officer sent to observe and report on Robert E. Lee, military observations of whom were documented in detail by Schubert and dispersed in Germany. They sure did like those Confederates, didn't they? Sending military observers to the United States during the Civil War was something Prussian military units indeed employed. What were they observing? What would an army with centuries of pedigree have to learn from either army fighting the American Civil War? I suggest the possibility that Prussian observers were more likely sent to determine how the conflict might weaken the young nation and to learn military specifics like troop strength, status of equipment, and resources should Berlin find themselves facing the United States in a campaign in the Americas. That such observers were indeed sent further encourages suspicion that the aforementioned Prussian-born officers serving in the U.S. Civil War were quite possibly collecting intelligence on American commanders, U.S. tactical philosophy, and readiness. Again, all this serves long-term Prussian Junkers invasion philosophy a la the Winkler interpretation of the Bull of Rimini. But exporting warfare was not the sole Prussian Junkers web-weaving enterprise going on during the U.S. Civil War. There were the bankers. David K. Thompson, author of Bonds of War, How Civil War Financial Agents Sold the World on the Union, writes, and I quote Thompson, "While some foreign investors did shift their money from American to European financial instruments at the war's immediate outset, the interest in American bonds quickly returned. Investors exhibited such interest not only among the normally cautious financial powerhouses of London and Paris, but increasingly in the more pivotal markets of Amsterdam and the German states. Amsterdam had long been a financial center, but its level of interest in American debt during the war and beyond far exceeded its antebellum investment. Furthermore, Frankfurt became a vital financial center for American debt during the war. Faith and kinship networks serving as key conduits for this financial exchange. In the case of Frankfurt, financiers in this city also leveraged anti-competitive market practices and a relative lack of transparency to fuel bond sales by major banking houses. The size and scope of investment during the war reveals the diplomatic and transatlantic elements of the war itself, end quote. Thompson elaborates on the situation, quoting Thompson again. U.S. debt sales abroad proved most successful in the German states, namely Frankfurt, and the Netherlands, especially Amsterdam. Frankfurt may have served as the most important market in Europe. Along the banks of the main river, this city became the central hub for U.S. bond sales during the American Civil War. The reasons for this are many and include factors such as banking networks centered around kinship and faith that stretched across the Atlantic to places like New York City, helping to facilitate these sales, end quote. Frankfurt may have been the face of German investment, but the central banksters in Amsterdam were making their long-term moves. I think this is still Thompson. I will quoting Thompson. Amsterdam also proved important to the cause of debt sales. By the spring of 1864, U.S. Minister to The Hague, James Pike, estimated that weekly transaction of Union bonds numbered $2 million in the city of Amsterdam alone. By the fall of that year, as Americans went to the polls to re-elect Abraham Lincoln, Pike claimed that U.S. bonds consumed an unlimited amount of capital on the Dutch exchange. Extensive correspondence from the Dutch House of Hope and Company and the Dutch-aligned New York City firm of Fisk and Hatch both affirmed the vibrant market for U.S. bonds in Amsterdam. By March of 1865, the banking house of North, Nachod, and Kuhn estimated German and Dutch houses held $250 million of the $320 million in U.S. securities abroad. And Thompson says that's a low estimation in his opinion. But whatever the exact number might be is largely beside the point, for without a doubt, a very large market existed in Europe during the American Civil War for U.S. debt, and these purchases went a long way towards stabilizing and reaffirming the legitimacy of the United States government during some of the darker days of the war, end quote. But German financial interest wasn't limited to opportunistic wartime investment. There is evidence of the duplicitous Prussian-Junker scheming that has been the theme of this book thus far in the pattern of war leading to depression and debt-based currency. I point out Otto von Bismarck's astute observation, or was it insider knowledge? During the depression of the 1870s, which followed the war betwixt the U.S. states, the German chancellor noted that Abraham Lincoln had elected to create government-issued debt-free currency to finance the Union's war effort. Bismarck curiously tips the hand of Prussian Junkers, by this point our proposed founders of NYMZA, in his very telling words. And I quote Bismarck. I know of absolute certainty that the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over Europe and the world. Of course, in the inner circle of finance, the voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They saw an opportunity for prodigious booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of a vigorous republic sufficient unto herself. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to drive a wedge between the two parts of the Union. The rupture between the North and South became inevitable. The masters of European finance employed all their forces to bring it about and turn it to their advantage. End quote. How much more clear does it need to be? The facts of history demonstrate that German financiers enjoyed market prosperity during the American Civil War, and there were certainly among those European financial masters who had orchestrated the conflict from the start, including the Rothschilds, whose first home base was Frankfurt, and, by virtue of their dominance over the financial scene of Europe, is the connection between Frankfurt and Bankster Amsterdam investment in U.S. bonds during the Civil War, an investment facilitating a Prussian Junker grip on America. But it gets uglier than mere financial manipulation, as Bismarck points out one glitch in the plan. Abraham Lincoln issued his greenbacks in rejection of debt to European bank lords, and that would not do. Bismarck said further, quote, "The government and the nation escaped the plots of the foreign financiers. They understood at once that the United States would escape their grip. The death of Lincoln was resolved upon." End quote. I'm going to pause right there. And decide if I'm going to take a break, because we're up to chapter 5 now. Let me take a break from reading. Okay. Wow, I've been going 3 hours. Dangity dang. Tell you, I get rolling, you guys. Let's see, how many pages are we at? This has 148 pages. I'm at page 61. So almost to the halfway point. Wow, get on a roll. Well, folks, I'm going to take just a little bit of a brief break. I'll leave the live stream going for you guys to talk in the live chat. If anyone hops in, tell them I'm going to take about a probably 10-minute break or something like that. And I'll be back on this because I decided last night I was going to read this for you guys this weekend. I need to, the details of this book. This book has been out for 3 years, and it needs to be, the information needs to be out there. I've given it 3 years for people to find it, and hey, it's time in this particular case to get the info out there. So I'll be back in about 10 minutes. Gotta go outside. Come on. Oh, boy. Okay, I'm back. All righty. You guys still with me? Let me see if I got this right. God darn it. I didn't want to do that. Okay, you guys still with me? Okay, you are here. All right. Okay. Damn it. Okay. I'm going to read one more chapter and then end this particular stream and just take a little bit of a break for a little while, and then I will probably come back online today and continue reading this. As I said, I'm on page 61 of 148. So I'm guessing chapter 5 will probably bring us up to or beyond the halfway point. And, you know, it's been a 3-hour roll, right? I've been on. So here we go. Wait a minute. Okay. I'm back. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 5, The Lizard's Hand. The implication is clear. President Lincoln, a head of state, was murdered for challenging the European, subsequently global, financial power elite. Let that sink in, for it is a reflection of the Prussian Junker tactic of feeding the host, in this case facilitating the necessary wartime income by facilitating U.S. bond sales, but then eliminating the prominent representative of that host through violent example, merely because he didn't go along with their secret plan. This is the emergence of the FEMA all over again. The financial element of the plan to bring down the United States by fomenting the Civil War was connected to the German Rothschilds in Frankfurt, and the elimination of Lincoln followed suit of a centuries-old strategy. 80 years before World War II and Operation Paperclip, the Prussian Junkers' German machine had assessed its prey. Had the NYMZA cabal actually facilitated the assassination of President Lincoln? Consider the story of Confederate spies operating out of Montreal, Canada, as discussed in Empire of the Wheel 3, The Nameless Ones. John Wilkes Booth was paid a total of $12,499 in gold by the Chaffee Company via transfer through the Bank of Montreal. Besides evidence of Templars in the city's past, Montreal has its 20th century connections to intelligence activities and occultists. It should come as no surprise that Confederate spies operated from Montreal for the city allows easy access to the northeastern United States, the Union States during the Civil War. There was also a solid German presence as well. If you know how the espionage world works, you'll recognize that mere cultural presence is enough of an open door for home country spies to enter and move about at will undetected. All that the Prussian Junkers NYMZA would need to embed agents in Montreal would have been provided by the German Society of Montreal, established by a German immigrant in 1835 by businessmen and professionals, and for them. Oops. The obvious purpose of the society was to assist German immigrants arriving in Montreal and to promote their culture and arts. Among the many walks of life represented by members were businessmen and diplomats. One of the objectives of the society was also to help German immigrants in need. This is where, in the espionage world, businessmen and diplomats likely played a significant role in Montreal. In the intelligence world, which I have a little bit of experience in, as you know, diplomats are up to their necks in espionage activities. They either facilitate or handle field operatives, or both. An important aspect of this is the disbursement of operational funds and payments, where it would be too compromising for the diplomat handler to pay directly. Using a go-between like a business transaction provides sufficient cover. This is the role some say the Chaffee Company played in the payment of Confederate spies. That's obviously where the businessmen come into the picture, and bankers at some point. In order to best separate a suspicious association between the diplomat and the spies, businessmen would facilitate a conduit for assistance to field agents working undercover. That's where the German Society of Montreal comes in. It would have been very easy and virtually undetectable for anti-union diplomats to pay and equip their field agents using their colleagues of the German Society to channel secretly earmarked funds donated for the cause. I suggest that the society could have been, and likely was, used by Prussian Junkers NYMZA cabal members to do just that, and have a hand in the very disruptive objective as previously identified by Chancellor Bismarck. Thus, if it was possible to contribute to the divisive war in the United States through the German Society of Montreal, it was certainly possible to pay John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Abraham Lincoln for his sin of defiance to the financial elite's plan. Consider the rumors that Booth survived the pursuit by Secret Service agents and Union soldiers, that the body in the burning barn was identified by multiple witnesses to not be Booth, that a man who died in Oklahoma in the early 20th century claimed to be Booth and bore all the injuries and scars Booth was well known to have, whereas the barn body did not. Included in that claim is that a password was used to allow Booth to make it through roadblocks that night. Reportedly, the post-Civil War government was anxious to settle the case and intimidated witnesses who initially reported conflicting details. What might this suggest? First, it could suggest that the body pulled from the burning barn was that of John Wilkes Booth, and there's nothing more to it. But do you trust the U.S. government where presidential assassinations are concerned? The second possibility is that it suggests Prussian Junkers NYMZA insiders providing both safe passage for Booth and a hand in the government cover-up. Consider the 19th century German immigration through Texas, and consider next that Delschau, self-identified agent for NYMZA in 1850, entered the United States on his mission from his home country through Texas and settled there before the U.S. Civil War. To an experienced intelligence professional, this looks like there was a support network for Prussian Junkers agents and operatives working in Texas. The John Wilkes Booth survival claims place Booth either in Texas or its neighboring state, Oklahoma, where he lived under another identity. A Prussian Junkers NYMZA hand in the events would nicely fill the holes in the Booth survival legend. The point is that the facts allow for a valid possibility that Prussian Junker's involvement in the Confederate spy ring to which Booth was directly linked, and therefore must also be seriously considered as a hand in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The Prussian Junkers could have been the source of payment to Booth to carry out the assassination sanctioned by the financial elites of Europe, thus proving Bismarck's assertion and giving the Prussian Junkers cabal more confidence with a strategy to line up the United States for future conquest. In their duplicitous style, of course. It would take time, but they were patient. With the traditional Booth story proving dubious, I have to question what hand the FEMA might have played in subsequent presidential assassinations. James Garfield, for instance, was assassinated by a lone nut, we have been told. His assassin, Guiteau, was indeed disturbed, but that simply qualifies the man as a suitable patsy. Why might Garfield have been marked for death by the Prussian Junker NYMZA FEMA? Garfield opposed Lincoln's greenback dollars, certainly, but not for the reasons the globalist central bankers opposed them. Garfield was a staunch supporter of the gold standard. That meant that the United States, competing for sources of the stuff, and eventually with shiny new Germany, central bankers wanted America under the slavery of their currency system. Under a Garfield administration, their elimination of Lincoln would have been for naught. One might suggest that this alone was the reason enough for the NYMZA Germans to want Garfield out of the picture. I say that another possible concern for the NYMZA Germans was Garfield's marginal involvement in the Credit Mobilier of America scandal, which deeply involved the Union Pacific Railroad, whose CEO, E.H. Harriman, fronted for NYMZA German interests in my analysis. More on him shortly. The question I have is, what did Garfield learn of the NYMZA German hand in the Credit Mobilier of America? Might they have been worried that a President Garfield would take action against their efforts and block their power plays? Might Garfield expose their agents embedded within U.S. industry and politics? That he could have validates the concern. Let's not get pedantic about the certainty fetish. We are exploring the unknown here. Finally, we have Garfield's enthusiasm for expanding the power and reach of the U.S. Navy and intervention in South American conflicts on behalf of the sovereignty of the nations involved. Considering what history does know of German activities in South America and what we have reason to suspect NYMZA Germans were involved in and up to there, it makes sense that such flexing of U.S. power in spheres of German interest would not do. Note that Garfield's successor, Chester Arthur, greatly pulled back the reins on U.S. Navy expansion. Perhaps Arthur saw the writing on the schnitzel plate and played his cards safely. My point is that we have reasons to suspect that James Garfield's assassination involved more than just a lone neurosyphilitic nut with delusions of grandeur and a gun chosen for how attractive it would look in a museum, as the story goes. And if we must question the standard version of the Garfield assassination, why not do the same with the assassination of William McKinley? President McKinley's assassination brings an interesting association with the Empire of the Wheel milieu and research in that it happened in the Temple of Music at the Pan American Exposition, this particular event in Buffalo, New York. In Empire of the Wheel, we present thematic links to the strange events in San Bernardino to the Pan-Pacific expositions hosted in San Francisco and San Diego, all in 1915. Whereas these events celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal, the 1901 fair, held in Buffalo, promoted the general goodwill and common geographical identity of North and South America. Of course, it's in the symbolism on display and the geomantic elements of these events which interest us here. Buffalo was a railroad hub within a day's reach for tens of millions of Americans at the time. Railroads, as we have learned from Latitude 33, A Key to the Kingdom, Empire of the Wheel, and Sechere's The Handprint of Atlas, are built along telluric currents, and their hubs are established at crossroads and mascon points. Yes, trains were and remain major means of transportation. That doesn't negate the mystical properties of their physical being. transporting people along telluric current to sites constructed on concentration of intersections of those currents and the effects of gravity found there is going to have its influence on the human psyche, and the more people, the merrier. Just as trains carried people to the 1915 fair site in San Francisco and to the exposition site in San Diego, the major railroad hub at the heart of the empire of the wheel was, and is to this day, San Bernardino, where the main ritual took place. It should be noted that Garfield was assassinated in a train station. The site of the assassination, the Temple of Music, just happened to have been designed by a German architect, Austin Eisenwein. I suppose we're not supposed to be curious about that. The Temple of Music is described as having been visually breathtaking in its beauty, but even more importantly, it was extremely electrified, so to speak, as in adorned with a dazzling display of lights. It also housed one of the largest pipe organs ever constructed in the United States, possibly a Kimball, which is currently in the St. Louis Roman Catholic Church in Buffalo. Close these pop-ups. This is all significant because the effects of dramatic lights and sounds and sights on the human psyche has long been the mainstay of priests and magicians in manipulating their audiences. Add all that to a site energized with telluric current, and the proposed phenomena of time and dimension suggested by Sechery, myself, and others. Now add an assassination suggestive of multiple levels of political and philosophical meaning, and you have a ritualistic slaying. Consider the assassination of William McKinley in the Temple of Music a crescendo, an emphatic note of affect on the psycho-political scale of dark intention. Was McKinley's assassin, Leo Kogols, an agent patsy of the FEMA? He was an American-born Polish laborer who became enamored of progressive and anarchist ideals. A member of the fraternal Knights of the Golden Eagle, Kogols saw himself as a crusader for the common worker. His reclusive nature and suspicious inquiries into local anarchist groups got him identified as a dangerous spy by a known radical newspaper of the day, which published a warning about him. Is this a clue that Kogols might indeed have been pushed into his activities by a clandestine association with the NYMZA Germans, with FEMA agents? It's definitely notable when a radical anarchist publication thinks you're too far gone for them, or that you may be spying on behalf of someone. Sorry. There is also the possibility that Kogols could have been working undercover for the law, but the known facts suggest otherwise. How might the FEMA have gotten to him? The recruitment by FEMA could have happened through the Knights of the Golden Eagle, described as a mildly socialist organization. Don't forget that cultural organizations can easily be used for espionage or clandestine criminal activities. It's quite possible that someone was working Kogols' mind through the ranks of the fraternal order. His order membership card, emphasizing his good standing, was found on his person at the time of his arrest. A FEMA agent could have been using the order as much as Kogols himself, disreputing and discarding both at the same time through the discovery of the association between the assassin and his castle lodge. Of course, we must ask why the NYMZA Germans would want McKinley dead. It shouldn't be surprising. McKinley, like Garfield, supported the gold standard for the United States. McKinley actively supported a strong and independent U.S. industrial base, including pushing for protective tariffs, which would get in the way of easy German conquest-driven industrial imports. Whatever you think of protectionism, McKinley was a staunch advocate, and that would be a problem for conquest-minded NYMZA Germans. Heavy tariffs and protectionism follow the gold standard resistance to central banker objectives in putting President McKinley on the FEMA hit list. So, with McKinley gone, the USA settled into right where NYMZA Germans wanted them to be in order to proceed with the usurping of the 20th century. 2 U.S. presidents had been assassinated over finance alone. Thus, we understand the commitment to enslaving the still young nation under the black magic of currency. They had to get to America to embrace, they had to get America to embrace paper money under control of the central bankers. Okay, that's 5 chapters. Let's see how many pages. Yeah, that brought us up almost to just 1/2. I'm going to take a break on this, folks. Thank you in the live chat for hanging out and being so supportive and all the good words and such. And I think there were some super chats, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you for the super chats. I will. There's one there. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you very much. Hey now. Hey, thank you. Thank you. So, okay, folks, give me probably, it could be a couple hours. It could just be an hour or whatever. I just want to take a break, give my voice a break. And this stream I am not going to take down. This one's going to stay up. So look, my plan is to come back on today and continue this. So you're not going to have to wait. I want this book here on the channel so nobody has an excuse to, they can't use the I can't afford to buy the book excuse, because they'll be able to hear it here. Anyway, I hope those of you who had not read the book or didn't know much about it find it interesting so far. And anyway, like I said, going to take a break. I'll be back in a little bit. I will put out a little announcement on the post, a heads up that I'm going live again. Feel free to share this link out there, please, and tell people that I'm doing this. So, okay, guys, I will see you soon. I'll see you again today.